Our story begins with a man who has been the legendary General Lu Bu for less than 3 minutes, only to find himself trapped in Xiaopei by 200,000 of Cao Cao's troops. He is about to reach the end of his life at the White Gate Tower, and facing such a disastrous start, he finds it impossible to remain calm. In just 3 days, his own subordinates, Ho Chung and Song Xian, will bind him and deliver him to Cao Cao as a peace offering. While cutting down Ho Chung and the others would be easy enough, the real problem is how to break through Cao Cao's siege and escape with his life. At this moment, his gaze turns toward the man standing beside him, Chen Gong, also known as Gong Tai. He asks what plan might save them now, but Chen Gong remains silent for a long moment before finally speaking. Given the current situation, Chen Gong admits there is no foolproof strategy if they truly wish to survive. The best they can hope for is a desperate, all-out struggle, a final gamble against the overwhelming odds stacked against them. And that, to be perfectly honest, is exactly the predicament they are facing right now. Outside the city, Cao Cao's army is formidable, and he has even diverted the Yi and Xi rivers to flood the area and tighten the siege. Now, in the entire city of Xiaopei, the only potential way out lies beyond the East Gate. The lands outside the west, south, and north walls have become a vast marshland, making them completely impassable. Inside the city, the military force has dwindled to just over 5,000 men. Morale is at an all-time low, and in a situation like this, not even the greatest strategists like Zhuge Liang or Pang Tong could find an easy fix. Even if Sima Yi or Jiasu were here, they would be stumped. Lu Bu simply says they must give it their all and try. At worst, they will die fighting with every ounce of their strength, but if they simply sit and wait for death, the end is certain. He fears they won't even see tomorrow's sun, so at this point, any possibility, no matter how slim, is a plan for survival. Chen Gong notes that Cao Cao's rear is currently vulnerable, which is a rare opening in an otherwise perfect trap. Regions like Yenzhou and Yuzhou have always been battlegrounds, surrounded by enemies on all sides. If they can find a way to hold the city and drag this out until next spring, the tides might finally turn in their favor. He notes that Yuan Shao and Zhang Xiu will surely strike Cao Cao's rear, but for now, they must focus on their own defense. The morale among the troops has hit rock bottom, and to be honest, none of them are particularly eager to fight to the death. Furthermore, the common folk and the local elite families in the city are far from being on their side. The most pressing issue, however, is the rising floodwater outside, which the city walls simply cannot withstand for much longer. This plan seems shaky at best, but he knows he must use both rewards and punishments to stabilize the army's spirit. Dealing with the local elites isn't impossible. A few public executions should be enough to intimidate them into submission. They could attempt to hold the line through sheer force, but the walls of Xiaopei are a different story entirely. Having fallen into disrepair over the years, the structures are now being battered by the relentless pressure of the floodwaters. At this rate, the walls will likely collapse within 10 days, or perhaps half a month at the very most. Counting on Yuan Shao and Zhang Xiu to harass Cao Cao's rear is a nice thought, but time is a luxury they simply don't have. Chen Gong continues, pointing out that the freezing winter weather makes moving an army an incredibly difficult task. Among the lords near Shuzhou, Yuan Shao is the only one with enough actual power to come to their rescue. If his lord trusts him, Chen Gong is willing to risk his life to break through the siege and meet with Yuan Shao personally. He vows to convince Yuan Shao to bring reinforcements, no matter what, though a month ago, this might have been easier. Yuan Shao might have helped then, but given the current mess, even a plea for aid from Gong Tai might not be enough. Lu Bu realizes that even if he knelt and apologized personally, Yuan Shao would likely still leave them to their fate. He knows Chen Gong is trustworthy, but it's futile. The Chen father and son have already secretly surrendered to Cao Cao. Yet the Lord still trusts them blindly, unaware he's falling into a trap that isolates him from Yuan Shao, even if Chen Gong succeeds. Even if Chen Gong managed to fight his way through the encirclement and convinced Yuan Shao to move, the journey alone is daunting. The round trip would take at least 2 weeks, and by then, it would be far too late. Chen Gong can only sigh in frustration. We see that Xiaopei is now surrounded by rising waters on 3 sides, leaving only the East Gate as a potential exit for the troops. However, his inner circle would have to wade through the western waters. They cannot simply sit and wait for a rescue that isn't coming. It seems there are no other options besides a breakout, yet he shakes his head, knowing Cao Cao is famously cautious with his deployments. With such overwhelming numbers, Cao Cao has likely reinforced the other 3 walls, even if the East Gate appears less guarded. Patrols are surely stationed everywhere, and since Xiaopei sits on a flat plain, the land outside offers nowhere to hide once they emerge. There are no mountains or forests to provide cover, making it nearly impossible to evade Cao Cao's scouts, a grim reality, to be sure. Even if he could fight his way out alone, without his generals and soldiers, where could they possibly flee? The breakout seems a desperate gamble. He acknowledges that Zhang Liao's leadership is top tier for this era, but the problem is, the man isn't exactly part of his inner circle. While Chen Gong, Gao Shun, and Ho Chung are trapped inside, Zhang Liao remains outside with his troops, neither surrendering nor rushing to help. Technically, he is still a general under Lu Bu's command, but anyone who knows their history knows how this story usually ends. Once Lu Bu is executed by Cao Cao, Zhang Liao is destined to surrender his army, and at this critical moment, that thought lingers. Deep down, he simply cannot bring himself to fully trust Zhang Liao. It isn't even a matter of the man's character, really. It is a matter of survival, and Chen Gong bows, suggesting that if the Lord could trust Wen Yuan, there might be a path to life. But if that trust isn't there, his advisor admits he has no other tricks up his sleeve to save them from their fate. As things stand, they are merely waiting for the end. Zhang Liao served Ding Yuan, then He Jin, and even Dong Zhuo before this. His talent is undeniable, but he lacks the unwavering, lifelong loyalty of someone like Gao Shan, which makes Lu Bu hesitate. To be perfectly honest, total trust feels impossible, yet Chen Gong's message is clear. Without it, they are already dead. He weighs the options repeatedly, realizing that if he cannot bridge this gap of suspicion, the internal divide will be their undoing. This is the great dilemma. If he cannot trust his general, then the only path remaining is the one that leads to their demise. After a long silence and much deliberation, he finally looks up with a serious expression, asking what would happen if he did trust Wen Yuan. We see that the battle for Xiaopei has been raging for over 2 months now, and the path forward remains dangerously unclear. Curiously, Cao Cao's forces seem to grow larger as the fighting continues, swelling from an initial 20,000 to nearly 30,000 men. Because Lu Bu is trapped in a lonely city with no clear escape, the influential families of Shuzhou have begun to reconsider their loyalties. It was easy enough for them to change sides and join Cao Cao's army, leaving the scattered remnants of the defeated forces behind in Shuzhou. In contrast, our protagonist started with over 10,000 troops, but after a series of brutal skirmishes, his numbers have dwindled significantly. He is left with barely 8,000 men. Zhang Liao holds 2,000 outside the walls, leaving only 5,000 to defend the city. To make matters worse, Cao Cao is accompanied by brilliant strategists like Gui Jia and Sun Yu, whose tactical minds are formidable. Their planning is easily a match for Chen Gong, and that doesn't even account for Liu Bei, the big-eared thief, stirring the pot nearby. With men like Chen Deng assisting the enemy, even if he could fully trust Zhang Liao, the situation remains incredibly bleak. He still cannot fathom what Chen Gong's supposed survival plan could possibly be, until the advisor finally speaks up. Chen Gong asks him to imagine a swap. If he were in Cao Cao's position, how would he go about breaking into Xiaopei? He considers this, noting that while his numbers are few, many are veterans from Binzhou who have followed him for years. Their combat strength is quite high, and though Xiaopei is currently flooded, the sturdy walls are still standing tall and strong. A direct assault would be foolish. If he were Cao Cao, he certainly wouldn't waste his men on a frontal charge. He concludes he would simply wait for the city to fall into internal chaos before seizing the moment to strike and finish them off. Chen Gong looks at him with a hint of surprise before nodding, agreeing that Cao Cao is indeed waiting for them to crumble from within. The advisor then suggests a bold move. What if they help Cao Cao along by making it look like a real rebellion was breaking out? He asks the Lord to imagine Cao Cao's reaction if he believed the garrison was finally turning on itself. It's a clever trap, really. Lu Bu realizes the plan is to fake a mutiny to lure Cao Cao's main army into a premature and vulnerable assault on the gates. Then, they could secretly signal Wen Yuan to lead his troops in a surprise raid on the enemy's rear supplies, destroying their vital grain. He suggests that the enemy outside would naturally retreat without a fight, but hearing this response, Chen Gong cannot help but sigh quietly to himself. A moment ago, he had wondered if his lord had suddenly grown wiser, but as soon as he spoke, his true nature was exposed once again. Seeing the look on Chen Gong's face, Lu Bu ponders for a moment and notes that the great army outside has them surrounded on all 4 sides. We see the first major difficulty. They have no way to communicate with Wen Yuan, and besides, Cao Cao is notoriously cautious with his troop movements. Cao Cao himself loves cutting off others' supply lines, so the idea that they could successfully raid his grain in such haste seems unlikely to succeed. As for the third point, the soldiers within the city have already lost their will to fight. If they were to stage a fake rebellion just to lure the enemy, and it failed, wouldn't they just be setting themselves on fire? Chen Gong suddenly laughs, noting that his lord's concerns are actually quite valid. He admits that Lu Bu has hit the nail on the head, though he clarifies that he never actually intended for Wen Yuan to lead a raid on the supplies. It seems that facing life and death really does sharpen the mind. Even though his lord didn't guess the plan correctly at first, he managed to identify the most critical obstacles with surprising accuracy. Lu Bu rubs his temples, feeling a bit helpless. He tells Gontai to stop being so mysterious and just speak plainly about what he has in mind. Chen Gong's expression turns serious. The advisor explains that his plan is divided into 3 distinct steps, and the first is indeed to create intentional chaos within the city walls. The goal is to make Cao Cao believe the garrison is so overwhelmed that they are ready to open the gates and surrender just to survive. Once Cao Cao leads his army to strike, they will move to the second step, having Wen Yuan lead all his remaining troops in a charge. They would strike directly from the flank into the enemy's rear, while Cao Cao is focused entirely on breaking through the city gates. Caught off guard by a sudden attack from behind, the enemy will surely fall into chaos, allowing their own forces to seize the moment and charge out. By joining forces with Wen Yuan, they could crush Cao Cao's army, then either station troops outside to hold them off or break through the route entirely. Lu Bu thinks this over, admitting the plan has merit, but he repeats his earlier concern that they have no way to send word to Wen Yuan. Without a way to communicate, how could they possibly ensure that Wen Yuan attacks the enemy's rear at the exact moment they need him to? After all, Cao Cao still has roughly 25,000 men under his command, and among those forces, there are many variables to consider. At least 4,000 or 5,000 of those men are surrendered clans from Shuzhou, and given Cao Cao's suspicious nature, he likely doesn't trust them. Since he doesn't trust them, he would never let those Shuzhou troops guard his rear. Therefore, if the situation in the city changes, the most likely scenario is that Cao Cao will appoint a newly surrendered general to lead their own personal division, to stay behind and guard the supply lines, while he personally leads the main army and those Shuzhou clans to the front. So, while the small force under Zhang Liao couldn't possibly raid the supplies, having him lead a sudden assault on the flank or rear is actually quite possible. However, the real issue remains that they currently have no way to contact Zhang Liao, nor can they be sure of what he is thinking. Chen Gong notes that to reach Wen Yuan now, their only option is to find a way to send suicide squads out of the city, and sending just one wouldn't be enough. They would need at least 10 men acting together. To prevent the enemy from discovering the plan if they are captured, these men must only carry verbal messages, never written letters. And most importantly, these individuals must be absolutely loyal to their lord above all else. Even if Cao Cao uses extreme torture, they cannot be allowed to reveal the truth. At this point, Chen Gong rubs his brow, looking utterly exhausted, and admits that whether these 10 men can successfully deliver the message to Wen Yuan, or if Wen Yuan will even follow the order, is now entirely in the hands of fate. Lu Bu suddenly stands up, pacing back and forth in the study with his hands behind his back, his silhouette shifting under the flickering lamplight. His shadow stretches long across the room before he finally stops directly in front of Chen Gong to ask one final question. He wants to know that if this plan actually succeeds by some stroke of luck, where exactly should they go once they leave the city? After all, Cao Cao's army isn't made of clay. Chen Gong's plan is, at best, a surprise tactic to move them from inside the walls to the outside. But with the heavy snow falling and the freezing cold, they would have no stable camp and no supplies once they were out. It would be impossible to withstand a full charge from Cao Cao's main force, so they would have to flee immediately upon breaking out. But as for where to run in such a hurry, Lu Bu truly has no idea. Chen Gong stands up, his long robes brushing the floor. Chen Gong explains that if their lord survives this disaster and escapes, the world will be wide open to them, but if this plan fails, all their discussions will have been for nothing. Lu Bu nods, ordering that General Gao Shun be brought to see him immediately. He has urgent orders for him. To be honest, Gao Shun is a tragic figure. In the original history, after the fall of Xiapi, Gao Shun was captured alongside Lu Bu. When Cao Cao failed to persuade him to surrender, he had him executed in a fit of rage. From that moment on, even in the heat of 1,000 battles, one would never again hear his famous cry. The will of the trapped camp is to die without life. When it comes to sending men on a suicide mission, Lu Bu has some self-awareness. Aside from his personal inner circle, most of his other troops are useless drunkards. Expecting them to sacrifice their lives for him? Well, that is a bit of a pipe dream. So, to send a message to Zhang Liao, it is far more reliable to find men from Gao Shun's elite trapped camp. A moment later, we see Gao Shun arrive in the room. He is about 30 years old, over 7 feet tall, with a powerful, imposing build. His expression is upright and stern. Clad in armor, he carries an aura of lethal intent as he walks. He wonders why his lord summoned him. Seeing Lu Bu sitting in the study, Gao Shun clasps his fists in a salute and speaks first. Xiaofu, Lu Bu begins, using his courtesy name. The situation in Xiapi has come to this. I must know, are the blades of the trap camp still sharp? Gao Shun replies that if the general has orders, the entire trap camp will immediately fight to the death. Gao Shun's character is, quite frankly, a breath of fresh air in these chaotic times. Ordinary soldiers fighting on the battlefield are essentially living with their heads tied to their belts, never knowing if they'll see tomorrow. After a great battle today, they might die in the wilderness tomorrow. Because of this, most generals spend their time lost in wine and women. And to be perfectly honest, the original Lu Bu was exactly the same. But Gao Shun is pure and dignified. He doesn't drink, gamble, or waste away. In fact, his personality makes him something of an outcast. He simply doesn't fit in with the rest of the rowdy officer corps. Even though the original Lu Bu knew he was fiercely loyal, he disliked his stiff personality and refused to give him his full trust. After inviting Gao Shun to sit, Lu Bu slowly explains the plan he and Chen Gong devised. There are 2 things that Xiaofu needs to do immediately. First, he must select 10 suicide squads from the army to find a way to deliver the message to Wen Yuan. Second, he must prepare in secret to charge out of the city at a moment's notice. Gao Shun remains silent for a long beat before speaking. He recalls how Ho Cheng's residence was searched, how the horse Wu Yin Ta Shui was recovered, and how Wei Su and Song Xian were punished for drinking. He asks if the general punished those three so severely just to set the stage for this current plan. He wonders if they are meant to defect and cause chaos within the city. Seeing the doubt in Gao Shun's eyes, Lu Bu maintains an air of mystery, confirming it is so. Chen Gong adds that the situation in the city is worsening by the day. The resentment Ho Cheng and the others feel for their lord is growing heavier. If nothing unexpected happens, they will likely make their move in the next few days. As long as Wen Yuan receives the message and strikes during the internal chaos, the enemy's formation will surely crumble. Then, Xiaofu can lead the warriors of the trapped camp as the vanguard. They will charge from the east gate. After all, the Shuzhou troops who recently surrendered to Cao Cao have only mediocre combat strength. With Gao Shun leading the charge, they can surely push through. Once the battlefield is moved outside the city, the Cao army will be crushed between them. Gao Shun thinks for a moment and admits that if the strategist's plan works, their chances of victory are indeed great. However, we must remember it is currently the dead of winter. If they rush out without a proper engagement, they might not be able to hold their ground once the enemy reorganizes. He asks what will happen when the enemy launches a fresh attack. In Gao Shun's view, the biggest instability in the city is the trio of Ho Cheng, Wei Su, and Song Xian. He believes they should simply be executed to ensure the remaining soldiers will fight to the death to defend Xiapi. No matter how high the floodwaters rise outside, staying inside the city at least provides the walls as a defensive point. Once they are in the open field, there is no cover to be found. Lu Bu speaks in a deep, somber tone. He explains that he doesn't want to abandon the walls either, but asks Xiaofu to consider something. Given Xiapi's current state, how much longer can those walls actually stand? Once the walls collapse, the commoners and noble families will flee in a panic. At that point, the army will be in total chaos, and the city's terrain will offer no advantage. He questions how their cavalry can truly perform, and how those tribes with such low combat effectiveness could possibly face the enemy army. Breaking out is merely the first step. Once successful, they must relocate immediately with the 5,000 troops remaining in the city. About 2,000 of them are cavalry, the old guard from Bingzhou who have followed him faithfully since their days in Chang'an. The remaining 3,000 are local recruits from Shuzhou whose loyalty, to be perfectly honest, was never very high to begin with. Their combat power is average at best, and expecting them to handle Cao Cao's elite is impossible. So, we see the true plan taking shape. Once they break past the walls, they will link up with Zhang Liao's cavalry and flee for their lives, leaving the slower tribes behind. In such a moment, there is simply no way to look after them. Seeing that the decision is made, Gao Shun stands and offers a heavy salute. He declares that he will go and make the arrangements. But as Gao Shun turns to leave, Lu Bu asks if he ever regretted following him. He finally couldn't hold the question back. In this city of Xiapi, any general might betray him. Anyone, that is, except for Gao Shun. Yet the previous version of himself had kept this man at a distance, and deep down, he felt a profound sense of guilt toward him. Gao Shun speaks calmly, noting that while 500 martyrs might die for a cause, even a king's cruelty has its limits. He compares himself to the loyalists of old. Since he is a general under his lord's command, he will follow him in life and death. He admits he has felt regret more than once, in fact, but regardless of the hardship, he never truly lost hope in his lord. With total sincerity, Lu Bu confesses his past failings toward Xiaofu and the old brothers who rode with them from Bingzhou. He vows that if they can just survive this crisis, he will change his ways and make amends for everything he has done. He asks Xiaofu to ensure those two tasks are handled at all costs. Gao Shun laughs, a rare sound in these dark times. He promises that if they survive this gamble, he will break his own rules and share a drink with his lord until they are both spent. Lu Bu declares that once the enemy is defeated, he will personally pour the wine to celebrate Xiaofu's success. With the plan settled, Gao Shun steps out into the wind and snow. Meanwhile, 10 miles east of the city, we find the camp of Cao Cao. For this campaign against Shuzhou, Cao Cao has gathered a brilliant constellation of stars, including formidable generals like Su Chu and Cao Ren. The camp is filled with legends like Xiahou Yuan, Cao Hong, Chen Deng, and Eugene, alongside the two brilliant strategists, Gui Jia and Sun Yu. Facing the current situation, Cao Cao knows full well that his prey is already trapped like a dragon in a cage, with no hope of escape. We see that the atmosphere in the Cao army camp is far more relaxed than inside the city as Cao Cao finishes his cup of ginger tea. Cao Cao gently warms his hands before turning to his strategist, Gui Jia, addressing him by his courtesy name, Feng Xiao. He asks how much longer the walls of Xiapi can hold, to which Gui Jia replies that the physical structures might last another 10 days or so. However, he notes that actually breaking the city's spirit will only take 2 or 3 days. Cao Cao points out that Lu Bu still has 5,000 troops. Most of them are the old guard from Bingzhou, who are not only highly skilled but fiercely loyal. If the walls don't fall, he worries it might be difficult To be honest, Lu Bu is already a tiger in a cage. Whether he dies sooner or later doesn't truly change the inevitable outcome. What actually weighs on Cao Cao's mind is Yuan Shao, who has already unified 3 northern provinces and is growing more powerful by the day. Yuan Shao will surely lead his army south across the Yellow River soon, while in Jingzhou, Liu Biao has stationed Zhang Xiu to threaten the rear. As for the Liangzhou region, since the deaths of Li Ju and Guisi, the various warlords there have fallen into a chaotic civil war. The entire line from Chang'an to Luoyang is now almost completely undefended, leaving the heart of the land vulnerable to any opportunistic raid. If those forces decide to plunder eastward, they could easily strike. This is why Cao Cao is so anxious to eliminate Lu Bu and return to his defenses. Guo Jia offers a bit of comfort, telling his lord not to worry, as he has already calculated the timeline of the city's fall. He predicts that within 3 days, someone will surely open the gates and surrender. Sun Yu nods, agreeing that Feng Shao is exactly right. He remarks that Lu Bu lacks the true temperament of a great leader. In his prime, he could suppress others with raw strength, but those days are gone. Now that he is weakened, a handful of soldiers could finish him. They need only wait outside the walls and watch the internal collapse unfold. Cao Cao laughs, deciding that since both Feng Shao and Gongda are so confident, they will simply wait a few more days for the fruit to ripen. The General Cao Ren speaks up, reminding his lord that while Lu Bu is trapped, Zhang Liao still commands 2,000 men outside the city. He suggests they should perhaps crush Zhang Liao's forces first just to be safe, but Cao Cao simply shakes his head, deeming it unnecessary. Lu Bu is, after all, a hero of his time, and even after his death, someone will eventually need to collect his remains. Since Zhang Liao once served under his command, it's only fitting to leave that task to him, Cao Ren remarks. He agrees with the plan to recruit Zhang Liao after the city falls, but he remains deeply concerned about Lu Bu himself. Lu Bu still has the strength for one last fight, and with Zhang Liao's army stationed outside, there are too many variables for comfort. Deep down, Cao Ren admits he feels uneasy, but Cao Cao simply laughs and tells him he is overthinking things. While Zhang Liao is a veteran from Bingzhou, he was never truly part of Lu Bu's inner circle, and more importantly, he never actually respected Lu Bu as a lord. He is simply waiting outside the walls to see which way the wind blows. He is watching our army's attitude, waiting to see if we will treat the Bingzhou veterans well once the city is taken. If we ensure the civilians are not disturbed, Zhang Liao will surrender immediately, but if we attack him now, he will be forced to fight. There are some things, to be honest, that don't need to be stated so plainly for everyone to understand. Cao Cao knows exactly what Zhang Liao is thinking. Once Lu Bu is executed and the city is ours, a simple offer of surrender will suffice, and Zhang Liao will likely accept while asking only for Lu Bu's body. Providing a proper burial would finally sever the bond of loyalty between them, allowing Zhang Liao to move on. Seeing that Cao Cao has made up his mind, Cao Ren bows and drops the subject as Cao Cao turns back to Guijia. He asks for the latest movements in Nanyang and Liangzhou, noting that while they are smaller than Yuan Shao's threat, the rear must be stabilized before he can focus entirely on the massive power growing in the north. However, the current expansion of those forces is limited to the Tongwan area, so they don't require much attention for now. As for Zhang Xiu and Wancheng, reports from our spies suggest he is currently preoccupied with securing winter supplies. He is currently bickering with Liu Biao, and in this freezing weather, he wouldn't dare mobilize his troops anyway. So, we have nothing to fear until next spring, Cao Cao notes with a cold smile, recalling how Liu Biao once took Jingzhou alone. It's not that he's generous, Guijia remarks. Unfortunately, as that man gets older, his heart shrinks, and he seems to be regressing. When Zhang Xiu surrendered to our army last time, Liu Biao likely hated him for it, only keeping him to block our southward advance. They would have fallen out long ago otherwise, as Zhang Xiu is now nothing more than a watchdog for Liu Biao, one that cannot be allowed to starve. Yet, he cannot be fed too well either. If a dog is too full, it either stops biting or turns on its master, which is a risk. Cao Cao notes in a low voice that since Nanyang and Liangzhou are quiet for now, they should simply continue to monitor them. Once we eliminate Lu Bu and stabilize Shuzhou, we can return to discuss how to deal with Yuan Shao, he says, issuing his command. He orders the soldiers to stay alert while sleeping over the coming nights, and the generals respond with a thunderous roar of agreement. As everyone departs to prepare, we see Cao Ren walking hurriedly toward Cao Cao's main tent during the 4th watch of the night. He finds Su Chu standing guard like an iron tower and asks if the Lord has retired, as he has urgent military intelligence to report. Cao Ren greets Su Chu briefly, attempting to walk straight into the inner quarters of the tent without waiting for an invitation. However, Su Chu steps forward with a dull, unwavering expression, blocking Cao Ren's path and stating that the Lord is already asleep. He tells him to share the urgent news first so he can relay it, as Cao Cao is known for his strict military discipline. Among the generals, there are very few who can enter his quarters without being announced, which makes this a delicate situation. Only Cao Ren and Xiahou Dun usually enjoy such a privilege, and normally, a guard would never dream of standing in their way. But Su Chu doesn't care about status. The Lord has finally found sleep in the dead of night, and anyone wanting in must pass him first. A slightly annoyed Chao Ren explains that the patrols captured several enemy scouts, a clear sign that Lu Bu is desperately seeking outside help. He demands to be let in, but Su Chu simply shakes his head, noting that Lu Bu is trapped in a lonely city, after all. It is perfectly normal, in his view, for a desperate man to send out a few loyal suicide squads to find reinforcements. Su Chu offers to go in and announce him, but adds that if the general hasn't actually learned anything useful yet, he should leave. Chao Ren argues that these scouts are suicide agents and won't talk easily, but Su Chu remains silent, unmoved by the logic. Since you haven't learned anything yet, General, you should return tomorrow morning. To wake the Lord now would imply he must personally interrogate the prisoners. Among the generals, Chao Ren feared no one, but Su Chu was a different matter entirely. After all, Su Chu was the commander of the personal guard. Since Jian Wei's death, he had earned Cao Cao's absolute trust. And since Chao Ren truly hadn't extracted any information from the captives, his anger, though simmering, had no place to go. After weighing his options, he let out a cold snort and swept away in a huff. It was now the 25th day of the 12th lunar month. In the camp 20 miles north of Xiapi, we find Zhang Liao staring intently at a topographical map spread across his desk. There were two major camps near the city of Xiapi. One sat 10 miles to the east, which served as the main Chao army stronghold. The other was his own camp. Looking at the distance between them, it was clear that the strategic balance was quite delicate. Cao Cao could have easily led his main force to crush Zhang Liao first before focusing on the siege, yet he chose a different path. The Chao army had been stationed there for over 10 days without once harassing them, a move that felt strangely deliberate. Deep down, Zhang Liao understood the message. Cao Cao intended to take the city first, then wait for Zhang Liao to surrender voluntarily. To be honest, Zhang Liao never had any intention of dying for Lu Bu, but his old subordinates from Binzhou were a different story. Those men were his brothers in arms. While the Shuzhou local troops might surrender safely, the Binzhou veterans faced a darker fate. Almost every one of them had Chao army blood on their hands, and Cao Cao was not a man known for leaving loose ends behind. The only way to save them was to lead a surrender and then convince them to serve Cao Cao with the same loyalty they showed him. It was the best possible outcome, yet even though Zhang Liao had made up his mind, he felt a sudden, inexplicable melancholy. Just then, the silence of the camp was broken as a personal guard hurried into the tent to deliver a report. A messenger had arrived from the city. Zhang Liao frowned, asking immediately if the man's identity had been verified. The guard confirmed it was indeed one of General Lu Bu's men, carrying a wax-sealed letter as proof of his mission. However, this time he brought only a verbal message, as the Chao army's siege had become far too tight for written scrolls. Breaking through the siege from within the city had become nearly impossible, and to prevent any leaks, a verbal message was now the only option. Zhang Liao ordered the man to be brought in. Moments later, looking at the messenger standing before him, he remarked that he recognized him. The man was Li Tong, a soldier from General Gao Shun's camp, who bowed and stated he had come specifically to deliver Lu Bu's words. Zhang Liao nodded, telling him to speak freely, though we should note that while others now called the protagonist Lord, Zhang Liao did not. You see, while Gao Shun and Qin Gong had already pledged their total loyalty to you, Zhang Liao still viewed the relationship as strictly professional. He had never officially acknowledged you as his master, so even now, he referred to the man in the city simply as General Lu Bu. The messenger, however, cared little for such subtle political nuances. He simply bowed again and relayed that his lord had spoken. He said that Cao Cao possessed the qualities of a great leader, and once Xiapi fell, Zhang Liao should feel free to surrender to him. He added that if Zhang Liao still felt any old affection, he could bury Lu Bu's remains in his hometown of Jiyuan. Zhang Liao had expected a desperate plea for a rescue mission, but hearing these words instead, he fell into a long, heavy silence. After a long pause, he finally asked if General Lu Bu had any other instructions, to which Li Tong bowed and continued the message. The messenger explained that if Zhang Liao found it too difficult to simply walk away, there was one final, daring plan on the table. Once the Chao army received word of a breakout, they would surely concentrate their forces to the east, where Lu Bu would lead the charge. In that moment of chaos, Zhang Liao could strike the enemy's rear, putting everything on the line for one final, decisive gamble. Regardless of whether Zhang Liao chose to cooperate, Lu Bu intended to lead his men in a breakout attempt that very night. Li Tong had memorized these words perfectly, delivering them in a single breath, leaving Zhang Liao to process the weight of the choice. Zhang Liao closed his eyes in deep thought for a long time before finally turning to his guard and issuing a stern command. He ordered the entire army to prepare for a night raid, a command the guard accepted immediately before rushing out to spread the word. With his mission complete, Li Tong went to find some rest, leaving the camp in a state of quiet, focused preparation. But moments later, another man burst into the tent in a frantic rush, shouting that Zhang Liao must be mad to help the trapped Lu Bu. He argued that the city was already a hollow shell, and at this stage, they should simply wait for it to fall before surrendering to Cao Cao. He demanded to know if Zhang Liao intended to send all the soldiers in the camp to their deaths for a night raid, a bold challenge indeed. The only person who would dare speak to him in such a tone was his elder brother, Zhang Sun, but Zhang Liao remained unmoved. He stated his mind was made up, prompting Zhang Sun to ask if it was really worth risking so many lives just to save a man like Lu Bu. Zhang Liao replied calmly that while he might not care about Lu Bu's personal fate, he couldn't ignore the soldiers trapped inside. Many of the 2,000 veterans from Bingzhou were men he had recruited himself, and he couldn't simply watch them be slaughtered. Zhang Sun tried one last time to reason with him, calling him foolish and insisting that Cao Cao only truly wanted Lu Bu dead. He argued that once Lu Bu was gone, the troops inside would naturally surrender and follow the path of least resistance. If Zhang Liao would only agree to submit, those Bingzhou veterans would likely end up back under his command anyway. Zhang Liao admitted his brother's words made sense, but noted that a true man must choose when to act and when to hold back. Had Lu Bu sent a messenger purely out of a desperate desire to survive, Zhang Liao would have happily ignored the plea. But because Lu Bu suggested surrender first before mentioning the breakout, Zhang Liao felt the man had earned his final support. You see, men of great talent often possess a certain pride, and Zhang Liao had never truly respected Lu Bu's previous actions. If Li Tong had arrived today with nothing but a standard cry for help, it's quite likely Zhang Liao would have done nothing at all. This psychological tactic of retreating to advance wasn't subtle, but it was perfectly timed. And who actually wants to surrender if they can win? Zhang Sun sighed, certain that the messenger's words had been carefully scripted by the strategist Chun Gong. He saw it as a clever trick designed to play on Zhang Liao's sympathy, asking if his brother was truly ready to die for Lu Bu. Zhang Liao looked out at the horizon, noting that Cao Cao's army was currently overconfident and convinced of their inevitable victory. Meanwhile, the men inside the city would be fighting for their very lives, and if the night raid was executed perfectly, they had a chance. Zhang Sun asked helplessly what a single victory would even achieve in the long run, but the wheels of the gamble were already in motion. He argued that even with a victory, they would just be running for their lives again in this freezing weather, unable to truly face Cao Cao. Zhang Liao stood with his head bowed, noting that the line between life and death is where a man's true character is forged. He believed that if General Lu Bu could finally change his ways after this, then risking their lives tonight would be well worth it. We see that Zhang Liao had two main goals. First, of course, was to rescue those veteran soldiers from Bingzhou trapped in the city. As for the second, he felt that if Lu Bu truly reformed, there might actually be a chance for a real comeback. Surrendering to Cao Cao seemed simple enough, but unless absolutely forced, who would willingly choose to be a traitor to their master? Zhang Sun smiled bitterly, reminding him that from Chang'an to Shuzhou, Lu Bu had never changed, and he asked what would happen if Zhang Liao lost this gamble. Zhang Liao remained calm, stating this was the last time he would help him. After this, his conscience would be clear. If Lu Bu remained unrepentant, they would simply take their troops and leave, for the world is vast enough to find a home elsewhere. On the night of the 25th day of the 12th lunar month, we find ourselves in the residence of Ho Chung within the city of Xiapi. Despite the freezing cold outside, as a high-ranking general, his quarters were quite comfortable, and the banquet hall was well prepared. Several braziers were burning brightly as a gloomy Ho Chung shared drinks with his fellow officers, Song Xian and Wei Su. A few days prior, Ho Cheng's precious horse had been recovered, and he had originally intended to hold a grand celebration. Instead, he had been harshly punished by a frustrated Lu Bu, an insult that might have been bearable under normal circumstances. But these were not normal times. As soon as the floodwaters receded or the walls crumbled, Cao Cao's army would come swarming in. To be honest, Lu Bu choosing this moment to flex his authority left Ho Chung feeling incredibly resentful and stifled. Although Song Xian and Wei Su tried their best to soothe him, the more wine Ho Chung drank, the angrier he became. He slammed his wine cup onto the table with a heavy thud, gritting his teeth as he cursed Lu Bu for going too far. He shouted that without the support of his brothers, Xiapi would have fallen long ago, yet they were punished over a simple drink. He declared he could no longer endure such treatment, prompting a panicked Song Xian to urge him to watch his words. He warned that the city was crawling with spies watching this very residence, and if they were caught drinking in secret again, it would be impossible to escape punishment this time. Among the three, Song Xian was the most cautious, or perhaps just the most fearful. Hearing Ho Cheng's drunken vows, he immediately tried to silence him, but Ho Chung just scoffed, asking what there was to fear. He insisted that every guard in his home was a brother who had faced death with him. None of them would ever betray him. Wei Su's eyes gleamed as he asked if Ho Chung was merely venting his anger or if he truly couldn't endure this life anymore. The question snapped Ho Chung out of his drunken haze. He declared it wasn't just talk, as they all knew exactly how dire the situation was. Rather than waiting to be buried alongside Lu Bu when the city fell, he suggested they take the initiative and strike first. If they surrendered the city to Cao Cao, they wouldn't just be looking for rewards, they would be securing their very lives. He looked at his comrades, asking for their thoughts, and Wei Su's eyes flashed again as he asked how they should proceed. Deep down, Wei Su was just as unwilling to die for a lost cause as Ho Chung was. When life offers a door, only a fool refuses to walk through. After a moment of thought, Ho Chung noted that Cao Cao's army had been surrounding them without attacking for days. Meanwhile, that man Lu Bu was doing nothing but hiding in his manor, drinking, and amusing himself while the walls sat neglected. He proposed they send a secret messenger to Cao Cao tonight to strike a deal and coordinate their timing for the midnight hour. They would find a way to open the east gate, allowing Cao Cao's forces to swarm in while the rest of the city remained oblivious. With the three of them acting as insiders, Xiaopi would fall in a single stroke. But Song Xian remained hesitant and cautious. He reminded them that Cao Cao was known for his ruthlessness, and his campaign in Shuzhou had already lasted over 2 months. They had killed many of Cao Cao's men. He wondered what would happen if the great general refused to negotiate with them at all. After all, the walls wouldn't hold much longer anyway. Once they crumbled, Cao Cao could simply walk in without their help. Ho Chung grew irritated, asking if they should just sit back and wait for death instead. It was then that Wei Su spoke up again. He told Song Xian he was looking at it the wrong way. While the army outside would eventually break through, an early victory was far more valuable. Wei Su argued that an early victory would finally put Cao Cao's mind at ease, and besides, the general was well aware of their Bingzhou army's strength. Without them acting as insiders, even if the walls crumbled, Cao Cao would likely lose another 2,000 or 3,000 men in the chaos. Only with their help could the city be truly pacified without a bloodbath. With their brothers assisting from within, Cao Cao could save thousands of lives, and unless he was a fool, he would see the value in this deal. To be honest, it was a logical gamble. Wei Su's words hit the mark, and Ho Chung grew excited, noting that with only 5,000 men left, the Shuzhou soldiers were already losing heart. Once the city fell, those troops would surely scatter in panic, leaving Lu Bu with no one to command except the 2,000 Bingzhou veterans. Since the three of them controlled at least half of those veterans, only Gao Shun's specialized camp guards would remain loyal enough to fight. It was 1,000 against 1,000. Even if they couldn't defeat Gao Shun, they were certain they could hold out until the main army outside the city arrived. What started as Ho Chung merely venting his frustrations had quickly evolved into a concrete plan. Suddenly, survival didn't seem so impossible after all. Wei Su nodded, noting that it was his turn to guard the gates tonight. This, as it turned out, was the perfect opportunity. He planned to head to the east gate shortly and dispatch a trusted messenger to slip out and deliver their proposal to Cao Cao. He told them that as midnight approached, they should gather their men and rush to the gate. Their lives would depend entirely on the next few hours. Ho Chung turned to the hesitant Song Xian, his voice turning cold as he warned that they were now riding a tiger and couldn't get off. If Song Xian joined them, they would live together. If he refused, Ho Chung made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to get his hands dirty. As if to emphasize the point, 2 personal guards who had been standing in the hall immediately moved closer, their intentions quite clear. Seeing the murderous looks on the faces of his 2 comrades, Song Xian took a moment to weigh his options before finally gritting his teeth. He agreed to the plan, declaring that since Lu Bu had shown them no mercy, they owed him no loyalty in return. A fair point, in a way. Deep down, he knew Ho Chung and Wei Su were dangerous men. Having heard their entire plot, he knew he wouldn't leave this manor alive if he declined. More importantly, Song Xian harbored his own deep-seated resentment toward Lu Bu, though he had always been too timid to act on it alone. But with the situation pushed to this extreme, even a cautious man like him realized it was time to take the ultimate risk. Ho Chung spoke with sharp resolve, telling Song Xian that he knew he could count on his brother and urged them to act immediately. To avoid any complications from a long night, the plan was set, and Ho Chung and Song Xian left to mobilize their personal guards. Meanwhile, Wei Su left the manor and headed straight for the east gate. 15 minutes later, we returned to the main hall of the city lord's manor. As Lu Bu and Chun Gong sat facing each other, Gao Shun suddenly rushed in from outside to report that the movement had begun. He informed them that Ho Chung and Wei Su were finally making their move. Lu Bu nodded, asking if the city's defenses were properly prepared. He also inquired about the specific movements of the traitors. Gao Shun reported that everything in the city had been arranged as planned. He had personally overseen the arrangements to ensure no one would notice. After Wei Su left Ho Cheng's manor, we see him heading straight for the east gate. If all went as expected, he was likely preparing to make first contact with the enemy outside. In the meantime, Ho Chung and Song Xian had split up to carry out their respective parts of the betrayal. Lu Bu rose slowly, deciding they would proceed with their own plan. Once the east gate was opened, he intended to act. They were going to give Cao Cao's army a very special gift. Gao Shun's leadership was formidable, and with Chun Gong's strategic mind, the plan for the counterattack had been finalized long ago. Once Wei Su opened the gate, Ho Chung and Song Xian would surely lead their troops to support him. However, Gao Shun's elite camp guards were already hidden near the east gate. This meant Gao Shun would be the first to lead his forces into a fierce clash with Wei Su. Because they were so well prepared, it wouldn't be difficult for Gao Shun to drive the rebels out of the gate. Once Cao Cao noticed the chaos at the east gate, he would immediately lead his main army forward to seize the opening. At that moment, Chun Gong, who remained in the city, would order the west, south, and north gates to be thrown wide open. When the news reached the Chao army, Cao Cao would likely assume that Lu Bu was trying to escape through the chaos. To be honest, it was a very clever distraction. Cao Cao would be forced to split his forces to intercept the other gates, leaving the strength at the east gate significantly diminished. This would allow Gao Shun to charge out with his elite guards, while Zhang Liao launched a surprise pincer attack from the rear. With this pincer attack, the Chao army would surely face defeat, though we must remember that Cao Cao himself was a master of warfare. Combined with the brilliance of advisors like Sun Yu and Guijia, it was uncertain if this plan would truly deceive him. Success wasn't guaranteed, but at this stage, they had no choice but to risk everything. Having received his orders, Gao Shun gave a solemn salute and withdrew. By the third watch, near the east gate, the north wind howled through the deep night. It was late December, a time when water turned to ice instantly, and atop the exposed city walls, the freezing wind was relentless. Dozens of Liangzhou soldiers huddled beneath the battlements, shivering as they stared out into the endless, pitch-black night. Wei Su felt a growing sense of anxiety, since he was the one in charge of the east gate tonight. Sending a messenger out to secretly contact the Chao army had been easy, meeting no resistance at all. However, his man had been gone for over half an hour, and there was still no word from the other side. He began to wonder if Cao Cao was actually unwilling to accept his betrayal. Just as Wei Su's mind began to spiral, he suddenly heard a faint bird call from outside the walls, which immediately snapped him back to attention. He quickly ordered his personal guards to lower the basket and pull the man up, hoping no one would notice the movement. This trusted subordinate had secretly slid down a rope from the battlements to avoid detection, traveling on foot to deliver the message to the Chao army, and now he was returning the same way. Daring not to light a torch in the dark, he could only mimic a bird's cry to signal his return. The guards pulled together, and within moments, the man was back over the wall, reporting that Lord Chao had accepted their surrender. Wei Su was overjoyed. He eagerly asked if Lord Chao had given any specific instructions for the next phase. The messenger explained that they were to open the gates and then destroy the winch mechanism to prevent the portcullis from dropping. Once the gate was secured, they were to light fires on both sides as a signal for the main army to charge forward. They only needed to hold the position for a short while until the vanguard entered. Wei Su nodded, ready to begin. First, we see them open the city gates and destroy the winch mechanism before sending word to General Ho and General Song. They were ordered to rush their troops to the east gate for support, where most of the soldiers were already Wei Su's trusted men. Even if a few were unwilling to join the rebellion, they couldn't cause much trouble. For Wei Su, however, the greatest challenge remained, holding the gate until Cao Cao's army arrived. Gao Shun's elite camp crushers, who were essentially perfect killing machines, would surely rush to reclaim the gate the moment they realized it was lost. To stand a chance against such elites, he needed Ho Chung and Song Xian's help. Upon hearing Wei Su's orders, the men in the courtyard immediately split up to take action. Meanwhile, at the main garrison camp of Xiapi, Ho Chung and Song Xian were already leading several hundred soldiers toward the east gate. Of the 5,000 troops in the city, most were on standby in the barracks, aside from those guarding the gates or patrolling the streets. The 3,000 Shuzhou soldiers weren't much of a threat, and Ho Chung and Song Xian weren't particularly afraid of them. However, Gao Shun's camp crushers were also stationed in the same camp, slipping out right under their noses. Well, that was never going to be easy, so they decided to simply march their troops toward the east gate in broad daylight. Their excuse was simple: a fire had broken out at the east gate, suggesting a rebellion, and they were merely going to help. Under the deep cover of night, their torches gathered together like a long, glowing dragon winding through the streets. Unfortunately, before they could reach the east gate, they suddenly noticed a figure standing in the firelight ahead. It was Lu Bu himself, standing tall and holding his iconic Sky Piercer halberd. To be honest, this was their worst nightmare. Ho Chung barely managed to steady his nerves before galloping forward in a panic. "My lord, the patrols report," he cried out, "that fires are raging at the east gate and the doors are wide open. It looks like a rebellion." Lu Bu looked at them coldly. "And so," Lu Bu said, "the two of you gathered your men to go support the east gate?" Ho Chung bowed. "Yes, my lord. Cao Cao is right outside that gate. If we are late, we won't be able to save it," Lu Bu replied icily, "since it is a rescue." Lu Bu asked why they had brought so few men and where the Shuzhou troops from the main camp were. Ho Chung replied frantically, "My lord, have you forgotten? Only you can mobilize those troops. We don't have the authority to command them." So, seeing the east gate in danger, I called General Song, and we acted together. We have to admit, Ho Chung was quite the actor. The original Lu Bu might have been fooled. But this time, Lu Bu spoke slowly, revealing that the fire at the east gate was no accident at all. "I ordered Wei Su to set that fire," he said. "Its first purpose was to lure Cao Cao into attacking. As for the second, I wanted to see exactly who the traitors in Xiapi were, those waiting to welcome the enemy into our city." Now, Ho Chung and Song Xian were undoubtedly marked for death. However, the soldiers under them were the elite of the elite. Finding a way to keep these men loyal was the real goal here. Upon hearing this, Ho Chung's face instantly twisted in panic. Before he could even react, Lu Bu continued, "Everything at the east gate is already settled. The rest of you may return to camp and wait. General Ho, General Song, you two will come with me to discuss military matters. Ho Ching might have been slow to react, but he wasn't a complete fool. He knew that if he sent his men away and followed Lu Bu alone to discuss matters, there was no way he would come out alive. In desperation, he leveled his spear. He shouted at the top of his lungs, "Lu Bu, you old fool, you deserve to die." Well, so much for his acting skills. He couldn't even hold his composure for a few minutes. Lu Bu asked coldly, "Ho Chung, are you truly choosing rebellion?" Ho Chung gritted his teeth. "You were the one who was unkind first. Don't blame us for being disloyal. Brothers, if you want to live today, follow me and fight your way out of the city." Both Ho Chung and Song Xian were veterans of the Bingzhou army. After all, they each had a fair share of die-hard loyalists. With Ho Ching's rallying cry, over 100 soldiers immediately began to move. "Who dares step forward?" Lu Bu shouted, leveling his own weapon. "Ho Chung and Song Xian have committed treason today. I will kill them. But for the rest of you, I promise no one else will be held responsible for their crimes. However, if you are determined to rebel, you'll have to answer to my halberd first." A man's reputation, as they say, carries weight. Ever since Ding Yuan's death, Lu Bu had remained the undisputed commander of the Bingzhou army, a figure of immense power. Even Gao Shun and Zhang Liao couldn't quite match his presence. And so, under the weight of his intimidation, half of the 100 loyalists standing by Ho Chung and Song Xian immediately began to retreat in fear. Ho Chung and Song Xian exchanged a desperate glance, gritted their teeth, and spurred their horses forward. To be honest, they had run out of options. The arrow was on the string and had to be fired. They felt that by fighting with everything they had, they might just survive. Surrender, they feared, meant instant death. Seeing that Ho Chung and Song Xian were determined to fight to the bitter end, we see a cold smile play across Lu Bu's lips as he rode forward. He knew that even with their few dozen remaining loyalists, he could wipe them out single-handedly. It was a bold thought, but not an empty one. After all, he hadn't just traveled through time. He had inherited this body's legendary martial prowess. And he wasn't standing alone, either. Gao Shun and the elite soldiers of the Camp Crusher were right by his side. Ho Chung and Song Xian's charge looked fierce and unstoppable at first glance. But in reality, they were cut down in mere moments. They didn't even manage to cause a ripple of trouble before it was all over. Once the rebels in the square were completely dealt with, Lu Bu shook the blood from his halberd and turned to give Gao Shun his next orders. He told him to open the camp gates and let the Shuzhou troops flee through the west, south, and north gates as they pleased. However, no one was permitted to escape through the east gate. Anyone who tried would be executed. It was a harsh condition, but a necessary one. Deep down, he knew these 3,000 Shuzhou soldiers held no loyalty to him. If Cao Cao attacked, they would likely turn on him from within. Rather than letting them become a liability, it was better to let them scatter. This would also serve to confuse the enemy's scouts and sow chaos. It might even lead Cao Cao to believe that Lu Bu himself was hiding among the fleeing crowds. Gao Shun saluted and immediately went to make the arrangements. A moment later, the camp that had been so quiet erupted into absolute madness, looking very much like a pot boiling over. Some soldiers rushed home in a panic, while others headed straight for the granaries to grab whatever food they could. But the vast majority of them simply bolted toward the 3 open gates at full speed. In truth, these 3,000 Shuzhou soldiers in Shopi City were in a difficult position. They didn't just dislike Lu Bu, they had no love for Cao Cao either. Years ago, to avenge his father Cao Song, Cao Cao had conducted a brutal campaign. He had massacred cities across Shuzhou, leaving so many bodies behind that the Sisui River was literally blocked by the dead. A grim memory, indeed. The soldiers felt that since Lu Bu and Cao Cao were going to war tonight, they might as well let them fight while they focused on saving their own lives. Meanwhile, on the wilderness east of Shopi, we see Cao Cao laughing heartily as he watches the flickering firelight at the city gates and observes his generals and soldiers charging forward with immense bravery. He remarked that everything was going exactly as Feng Xiao had predicted. With Shopi in such a state, Lu Bu's remaining forces were surely doomed. He then issued a grim command. He ordered that no blade be sheathed before dawn, granting his soldiers permission to loot the city. Because of his father Cao Song's death, after all, Cao Cao held no affection for the noble families or the common people of Shuzhou. Allowing his troops to pillage the city after its fall was actually a significant concession on his part. Had he not considered the feelings of allies like Chen Deng, he might have simply ordered a total massacre. Just as Cao Cao was issuing these orders, Cao Hong suddenly galloped in from a distance to report some urgent news to his lord. Scouts from the front had reported that in addition to the east gate, the west, south, and north gates had also been opened, and many enemy soldiers were currently wading through the water to escape. In the darkness of the night, however, it was impossible to tell which gate Lu Bu was near. Cao Cao stroked his short beard and gave his instructions, ordering that a force be sent to the west, south, and north gates. He deployed 1,000 infantry to guard each gate and told Zai to keep the cavalry unit on standby at all times. The moment Lu Bu's tracks were discovered, they were to pursue and kill him immediately. Compared to the immense wealth and resources of Yuan Shao, Cao Cao simply didn't have that many cavalrymen under his command. For this entire campaign to conquer Shuzhou, He had only brought 1,000 cavalry, led by Cao Chun. Cao Hong accepted the order and immediately went to make the arrangements. Suddenly, Wujia frowned and addressed his lord, noting that 5,000 troops had already been left behind in the main camp to guard the supplies. If they were to split their forces further by sending another 1,000 men to each of the 3 gates, and with General Zai's cavalry waiting to join the pursuit, the actual strength they had left to storm the city was less than 10,000 men. He worried that since Lu Bu had always been exceptionally brave, if he put everything into a breakout attempt, they might not be able to stop him. Cao Cao, however, was quite confident. He told Feng Xiao that he was overthinking it, as the fact that all 3 gates were wide open proved that those 3,000 Shuzhou soldiers in the city had no intention of serving Lu Bu and were simply running for their lives. He reasoned that with Wei Su, Ho Chung, and Song Xian combined, they could control at least 1,000 men. This meant Lu Bu could only mobilize about 1,000 troops tonight. Even if his camp was filled with elite veterans, what of it? With a 10-to-1 advantage, we are already invincible. Gui Jia still felt something was off, but after thinking it over, he truly couldn't find any obvious flaws in the logic. Chao Run then chimed in, noting that Lu Bu had always been more brawn than brains. However, he worried that if the main army struggled to move, Wei Su and the others might not be able to wait for them. Cao Cao simply laughed. He explained that in tonight's battle, our army attacks while the enemy defends. The moment those gates swung open, the enemy lost their only protection. As for Wei Su and Ho Chung, those useless fools, expecting them to sneak the gates open and destroy the portcullis was enough. To truly break the army and take the city, he relied on the bravery of his own soldiers. If the city walls were still manned, Cao Cao would never have launched a direct assault. But now, with all 4 gates wide open, the city was already in total chaos. With his heavy troops surging forward, how could Lu Bu possibly avoid defeat? Even if the struggle for the gates turned into a brutal bloodbath, Cao Cao maintained absolute confidence in his men. Seeing that Cao Cao had made up his mind, Cao Ren cupped his fists and ceased his questioning. To be honest, there was nothing left to say. Cao Cao then turned to Eugene, who was standing nearby, and told him that the command of tonight's siege was in his hands. While he could have given the overall command to Cao Ren, we see that in Cao Cao's eyes, Eugene's leadership was far more meticulous. Besides, Eugene was already known far and wide as a formidable Han commander. And so, Eugene was sent to lead. He accepted the order, gripped his long spear, and felt the weight of the moment. He immediately mounted his horse and galloped toward the east gate. Originally, Eugene had been a subordinate of Cao Cao's friend, Bao Xian. After Bao Xian died, saving Cao Cao, Eugene was highly recommended and eventually joined Cao Cao's personal service. Despite that connection, when compared to the Cao or Xiahou brothers, Eugene was still considered an outsider. Even when measured against generals like Su Chu or Eugene, he had to work twice as hard to prove his worth. He wasn't among the very first generals to join Cao Cao's cause, and perhaps because of that, Eugene worked much harder than the others, maintaining a strict and disciplined military code. Because he carried himself with such integrity, Cao Cao trusted him deeply, which is why he was chosen for tonight. Beyond trusting his ability, Cao Cao also wanted to give him a chance to earn more merit and prestige. Excluding the camp guards and the soldiers lying in ambush at the other gates, Eugene had a total of 8,000 men at his disposal, though over half were surrendered Shuzhou troops. Roughly 5,000 were new recruits, while the remaining 3,000 were Cao Cao's true elite veterans. To break through the gates quickly, the logical choice would be to put the elites at the very front. He could have used the Shuzhou troops as backup, but deep down, Eugene understood the situation perfectly. Cao Cao had no intention of wasting his own elite forces in the opening chaos of the assault. So, Eugene decisively placed the 5,000 Shuzhou men in front, with the 3,000 elites bringing up the rear. At the east gate of Xiapi, as the army drew closer, Wei Su felt a surge of nervous excitement. If the army entered smoothly, he wouldn't just get a reward, he would avoid being buried alongside Lu Bu. Unfortunately, before the main army could arrive, Gao Shun and his trapped camp reached the east gate first. Wei Su only had a few hundred men. They stood no chance against the ferocious warriors of the trapped camp. In mere moments, his lines were shattered, and his men cried out that they could no longer hold. Since the gate was already destroyed and the army was outside, they suggested retreating to the safety of the plains. Wei Su grit his teeth, wondering where Ho Chung and Song Xian were, as he hadn't seen them anywhere. His men feared the worst. If Gao Shun was here in person, the other 2 had likely already been executed. Seeing his inner circle dwindling and Gao Shun closing in, Wei Su finally gave the order to retreat. They all retreated outside the city walls, even though staying to welcome Cao Cao's army would have earned them much greater merit. But Gao Shun was now seeing red, and Wei Su knew that if he delayed for even a moment, he would lose his life, and what use is merit then? With that desperate shout from Wei Su, his remaining 100 loyal followers immediately abandoned the city and fled for their lives. In just a few moments, the area around the east gate became empty once more, and Gao Shun ordered the first squad to clear the battlefield. After moving the rebel corpses out of the gateway, the second squad prepared the assault wagons to charge the moment the enemy approached. At his command, the bodies of the rebels scattered across the ground were quickly cleared away, leaving the path open. 6 assault wagons were already prepared. These were essentially horse-drawn carriages modified for the chaos of war. The roofs and fronts were reinforced with thick wooden planks and several sharpened logs, making them look like wooden porcupines. The wall at the east gate of Shopee was only about 20 feet wide, which limited their tactical options significantly. At most, only 2 wagons could move side by side, so the 6 vehicles were arranged in 3 rows of 2. Each wagon was pulled by 2 sturdy horses, and to protect them from enemy arrows, the animals were draped in thick layers of cloth armor. As for the 6 soldiers tasked with driving these wagons, they were similarly encased in heavy armor for the coming collision. The terrain near the gate was far too narrow for a traditional cavalry charge, so these wagons were given a very specific mission. Their job was to drive forward with everything they had to open a path, even as the enemy drew closer outside. Inside the city, the soldiers looked on with solemn expressions as Gao Shun was asked how he thought the enemy would deploy. Gao Shun replied that for Cao Cao's army, the most critical objective of tonight's surprise attack was speed. They needed to burst into the city as quickly as possible. In a normal battle, the elites would surely lead the way. However, Cao Cao had relatively few elites, and more importantly, Gao Shun believed there was a second factor at play. He suspected that Cao Cao didn't fully trust the surrendered Shuzhou troops, so he would likely place them in the front lines. The elite Cao forces would then follow behind to maintain order, a clever, if somewhat cold, calculation by Cao Cao. Compared to his own elite troops, Cao Cao would much rather lose 200 or 300 surrendered soldiers from Shuzhou. He wasn't willing to lose a single elite soldier, so tonight's layout was likely exactly as Gao Shun, our stoic commander, had predicted. Outside the city gates, the mass of Cao Cao's army was drawing closer, with the vanguard now only a few dozen meters away. From his horse, Eugene shouted his orders, commanding the shield-bearers to move forward and the archers to spread out and suppress the walls. The spearmen were to provide support from the rear, ready to follow the moment the shield-bearers broke into the city. There was no moat outside the east gate of Shopee, as the trenches had long since been filled in by Cao Cao's forces. Consequently, the advancing army met no obstacles at all as they pushed forward under Eugene's direct command. Over 100 shield-bearers split into 3 units, crouching behind their protection as they sprinted toward the opening. As for Wei Su's defeated remnants, they had already scattered in all directions after fleeing the gate, leaving the path clear. Seeing the enemy had reached the threshold, Gao Shun gave the order with a calm expression. The assault wagons were to charge. The 6 wagons, divided into 3 rows, rumbled directly into the dark tunnel of the city gateway. Because of the narrow passage, the advancing Cao soldiers couldn't see what was happening inside until the first 2 wagons were upon them. By the time they saw the wooden monsters clearly, it was far too late to dodge, and desperate cries to retreat rang out. The momentum of the wagons was simply too much to stop, and the soldiers tried to scramble back toward the outside. But the space inside the gateway was cramped, and the wagons were moving with terrifying speed toward the trapped shield-bearers. Under the crushing charge of the 6 vehicles, the enemy line was instantly shattered like dry wood. Some were impaled by the front spikes. Others were knocked down by the heavy frames and trampled, and within moments, the gateway was filled with the sounds of agony. The 6 wagons plowed straight through, giving the Cao shield-bearers no chance at all to escape back to the open field. Even after bursting out of the gateway, their momentum remained unchecked as they continued their deadly path toward the 100 soldiers. A dozen men were killed instantly by the impact, while the survivors broke formation in a panic, unable to offer any resistance. Behind the shield-bearers, a squad of Cao Cao's spearmen followed closely, keeping toward them. The commander of the spearmen felt his heart sink with dread. Yet, he had no choice but to brace himself and bark out orders for the archers to fire and stall the enemy. He commanded the spearmen to hold their ground against the wagons, warning that anyone retreating without orders would be executed. Cao Cao's military discipline was famously strict. In battle, one was expected to stand firm or face a grim end. The commander of the shield-bearers ahead had already been crushed by a wagon, and the gateway was simply too narrow to maneuver. They were forced to retreat, but the spearmen found themselves in a different situation as the area around them was quite open. Even if they couldn't stop the wagons, they could at least maneuver, and retreating without a fight was not an option. To be honest, if he didn't wait for Cao Cao's order, Eugene, watching from the rear, would likely execute him himself. Under the commander's urgent shouts, the archers on both flanks immediately began raining arrows down upon the wagons. Unfortunately, the wagons were reinforced with thick wooden planks. The arrows simply bounced off without piercing the frames. As for the soldiers driving the vehicles, they were clad in heavy armor, making the incoming arrows a minor nuisance at best. Seeing that the archers were achieving nothing, the remaining spearmen realized they had to take matters into their own hands. They lunged forward with their long spears, desperately trying to unseat the enemy soldiers from the charging wagons. But the wooden spikes mounted on the wagons were longer than their spears, reaching them before they could even get close. In an instant, they were impaled by the wooden beams, and the Chao soldiers outside the gate fell into total disarray. Inside the gate, Lu Bu sat tall on his horse. Seeing the enemy formation shatter, he raised his heaven-piercer halberd. He signaled the charge, shouting that the trapped camp knows only death or victory, urging his brothers to follow him into the fray. Now, these assault wagons are terrifying when used in narrow terrain, where they can rampage without any resistance. However, once they reach the open field, they lose their deadly effectiveness, which is why Lu Bu chose this exact moment to strike. Leading a cavalry charge was the ultimate opportunity, and with a single command, Lu Bu was the first to gallop out into the fray. The soldiers of the trapped camp were already the elite of the elite, and seeing their commander leading from the front only fueled their fire. None of them were willing to fall behind. As they burst through the gates, Lu Bu swung his heaven-piercer halberd in lethal arcs. Cao Cao's shield-bearers and spearmen were cut down instantly. These former Suzhou soldiers, now serving Cao Cao, knew Lu Bu's prowess all too well. Knowing the terrifying combat power of the trapped camp, very few had the courage to actually step forward and block their path. As more and more warriors from the trapped camp poured out of the city, the surrendered Suzhou troops found themselves utterly overwhelmed. They were forced into a chaotic retreat. Meanwhile, in the heart of the main army, Eugene was watching the unfolding battle with intense focus. All 4 gates of Xiapi had been flung open, making it possible for Lu Bu to attempt a breakout from any direction. Since Eugene wasn't responsible for the other 3 gates, deep down, he was actually hoping Lu Bu would choose his side. If he could kill or capture Lu Bu right here at the East Gate, his prestige among Cao Cao's generals would skyrocket, which was his true goal. Seeing Lu Bu actually attempting the breakout here, an excited Eugene immediately ordered his spearmen to fight to the death without retreating. He commanded the archers to fan out and rain death upon the enemy, while ordering the elite reinforcements from the rear to push forward. He organized the shield-bearers in front and spearmen behind, while sending an urgent message to General Cao Chun. He requested that Cao Chun bring his 1,000-strong cavalry immediately, as they were the only mobile force Cao Cao had left in reserve. Had Lu Bu remained hidden, Cao Chun would have stayed back to observe. However, the intent to break through the East Gate was now clear. This was the perfect moment for those 1,000 riders to be put to use under Eugene's calculated command. While the surrendered Suzhou troops fought desperately at the front, Cao Cao's true elites moved up quickly with shields and spears ready. The battlefield was a scene of pure carnage. With a single, fluid strike, Lu Bu brought another enemy down. He turned to Gao Shun and gave his orders. Xiaofu, take the brothers of the trapped camp and continue the push through the center. He then assigned the cavalry to handle the flanks. Gao Shun simply cupped his fists and replied, "Understood, my lord. Our army is strong, but we are few. The enemy is weak, yet they outnumber us nearly 10 to 1. If we hesitate and stay locked in this struggle, what will we do if the enemy regroups?" Gao Shun had a different plan. Since the enemy's front line is already crumbling, he felt it was time to move quickly. But where would they go? There was no cover outside Xiapi. Even if they escaped now, without supplies, they would be vulnerable. The men would eventually freeze or starve, so the only reason to keep fighting now was tactical. They needed to lure the enemy cavalry in, creating an opening for Zhang Liao, which was a bold move, to say the least. With only 1,000 cavalry and slow-moving infantry, reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time for tonight's battle. But if Zhang Liao did lead his riders to help, Cao Chun would surely receive word of the movement. Cao Chun would then lead his own unit to intercept, which, strangely enough, was exactly what Lu Bu expected. He was certain that once the enemy saw the breakout at the East Gate, they would deploy Cao Chun's cavalry. And once those riders were committed, they could no longer stop Zhang Liao. Gao Shun gave a heavy salute. He accepted the command, as we see him leading the trapped camp warriors forward with everything they had. As for those surrendered Suzhou troops, they couldn't stand a chance against Gao Shun's relentless full-scale charge. The field was already littered with the fallen when a scout rushed into the heart of the Cao army. He reported that the front lines were breaking, but Eugene coldly ordered the execution squads to move forward. Anyone caught fleeing the battlefield was to be cut down immediately without the need for a report. Until General Cao Chun's cavalry arrived, those men were expected to die right in the enemy's path. Their only job was to be a temporary obstacle, as Eugene's true goal tonight was the death of Lu Bu. Whether 1,000 or 2,000 Suzhou prisoners died in the process, Eugene didn't truly care. Upon hearing the commander's ruthless order, the messengers hurried to send the execution squads to the front. The order was clear. Anyone caught fleeing was to be cut down without a report. After several such commands echoed out, the Cao army's execution squads immediately drew their great swords and strode forward onto the chaotic battlefield. We see Lu Bu leading a troop of cavalry, clashing left and right. To be perfectly honest, his skill was unmatched. The combat effectiveness of these surrendered Suzhou troops was truly mediocre. They only fought because Eugene's squads watched them. Had those blades not been at their backs, they likely would have scattered long ago. Lu Bu charged on, yet he remained observant. He was waiting to see if Cao Chun's cavalry had finally arrived. Just as he was cutting through the ranks, A general suddenly burst from the blood-soaked fray, screaming for Lu Bu to stop and pay for his father's life. Lu Bu was instantly enraged, shouting that this traitorous rebel and his father would be reunited in the afterlife tonight. This man was Chen Deng, also known as Yuan Long, one of the key figures who helped Cao Cao take control of Suzhou. When Lu Bu first discovered the betrayal of the Chen family, he had immediately thrown Chen Gui and Chen Deng's brothers into prison. Although the three brothers were secretly rescued, their father, Chen Gui, was executed by Lu Bu in a fit of absolute rage. His head had even been hung on the city walls for 3 days as a warning. For some time now, Chen Deng had been waiting for the city to fall so he could claim his revenge. Cao Cao, fearing his impulsiveness, had actually ordered him to stay behind and guard the main camp during tonight's raid. Unfortunately, Chen Deng ignored those orders. He had slipped away on his own, and now, seeing his father's killer before him, his fury reached a breaking point. Chen Deng gripped his spear and charged forward like a predator. He had a long history, starting as the magistrate of Danyang. Later, he had been promoted by Tao Qian to the position of agricultural colonel, proving his worth early on. After Lu Bu took Suzhou by force and assumed command, the regional power dynamics shifted drastically. On paper, Chen Deng had become Lu Bu's subordinate, but the Chen family had always looked down on him. Seeing that Liu Bei couldn't hold power, they secretly turned to Cao Cao. Chen Deng himself was a man of both letters in war. Furthermore, as a key figure among the Suzhou clans, Cao Cao held him in exceptionally high regard. However, driven by the burning desire to avenge his father, Chen Deng simply couldn't bring himself to stay put in the main camp. On the battlefield, we see Chen Deng drawing closer, his long halberd held horizontally as he prepares to strike. He unleashed a mountain-splitting blow directly at Lu Bu's head. Now, while Chen Deng's martial skill wasn't weak, in the eyes of the world's greatest warrior, it was barely worth noticing. With a sharp crack, Chen Deng's spear snapped clean in two under the force of the clash. Before he could even react, Lu Bu spun his halberd and lunged forward in a sudden, violent thrust. The distance between them was already dangerously close. Combined with the sheer speed of the strike, Chen Deng had no time to fully retreat. He could only desperately twist his body to the side. Yet, Lu Bu's killing moves are never that easy to avoid. Although he managed to save his heart, the blade found its mark elsewhere. The strike pierced deep into his left shoulder. To be honest, with Chen Deng's actual strength, he shouldn't have been defeated quite so easily. But his frantic need for revenge had clouded his judgment, leading him to rush into a reckless duel he couldn't possibly win. With his spear shattered and his shoulder bleeding, Chen Deng's thoughts of vengeance vanished instantly. He threw down his broken weapon, turned his horse around, and prepared to flee. He told himself that once the city fell tonight, Lu Bu would be a dead man anyway. There was no reason to throw his own life away just yet. But as we see Chen Deng attempting his escape, Lu Bu gave a cold laugh, planted his halberd in the dirt, and drew his longbow, pulling the string back until it was as round as a full moon. The arrow whistled through the air. Chen Deng, who had barely managed to flee a few yards, was struck in the neck and tumbled from his horse. In the absolute chaos of the battlefield, Chen Deng's death was merely a small interlude. After securing the kill, Lu Bu continued to lead his cavalry in a fierce charge. It was at this exact moment that Cao Chun finally arrived with his elite riders. Cao Chun, however, wasn't foolish enough to challenge Lu Bu in a one-on-one duel. Instead, he stayed on the perimeter, directing his men forward. His goal was to tie down the enemy cavalry on both flanks. While Gao Shun's camp crushers were formidable, they were primarily infantry, meaning they couldn't simply run away. As long as the battle remained a stalemate, Cao Chun was willing to trade lives for time. At the very least, he was certain that tonight he would finally wipe them all out. From the moment Lu Bu led his army out of the city, the entire battle had raged for nearly an hour. Although the Chao clan's forces had been battered and scattered in places, their sheer numbers were overwhelming. With Eugene commanding from the center, they continued to fight on with relentless, stubborn energy. Meanwhile, Cao Chun's cavalry kept weaving through the chaos, launching thrusts that managed to hold the outer perimeter firm. They gave Lu Bu's soldiers no chance to break through. Among Gao Shun's elite camp crushers, casualties had already exceeded 300 men. In any other army, such losses would have caused the formation to collapse long ago. Fortunately, with both Lu Bu and Gao Shun present, the lines held steady. After skewering an enemy soldier, we see Gao Shun gasping for breath as he speaks. He warns that if Zhang Liao doesn't arrive soon, they will all meet their end right here. Lu Bu gazes into the distance, knowing that life and death are often left to fate. The siege of Xiapi was always a desperate gamble. If Zhang Liao chose to lead his troops here, it would be ideal. If not, there was simply nothing more he could do. Within the main Xiao formation, Eugene was focusing all his attention on the shifting tides of the battlefield. He told himself that if he could capture or kill Lu Bu tonight, his own prestige would soar. The enemy is tiring, Eugene noted coldly. He issued the command for the army to close the net and ensure Lu Bu did not escape. The order echoed across the ranks. Following Eugene's signal, the Chao soldiers summoned their remaining courage and surged forward. Cao Cao was a strict disciplinarian, never hesitating to punish failure or reward merit. This battle for Xiapi had dragged on since October, and tonight was the final chance to earn glory. Even if they couldn't take down Lu Bu, they were determined to kill as many enemies as possible. At the rear of the Chow lines, we see Cao Cao himself standing upon a high platform, watching the front with a keen eye. Seeing his men pressing forward with such vigor, Cao Cao laughed, convinced that the reckless Lu Bu would finally be captured tonight. By leading his troops out of the city, Lu Bu had cut off his own retreat. Breaking through might have been an option, but the soldiers at the east gate had been delayed too long by Yu Jin's blockade. From the look of things, Lu Bu's luck had finally run out. While Cao Cao remained optimistic, Guojia didn't share his confidence, admitting that deep down, he felt a lingering sense of unease. Cao Cao simply laughed, noting that all 4 gates were open and their forces had already begun surrounding the east gate. He believed that in a few moments, Lu Bu would either be dead or captured, wondering what else there was to worry about. Guojia frowned, reminding his lord that the fierce battle at the entrance had started the very moment the east gate opened. The more he thought about it, the more he felt something was wrong, even as Cao Cao pointed out Wei Su's betrayal. Their army had rushed to the east gate immediately, and while the Shuzhou soldiers were average fighters, they still had the advantage of numbers. Lu Bu might have been able to flee on horseback alone, but he still had the soldiers of the Camp Crusher unit with him. Furthermore, his own family was still inside the city, and if he couldn't push back Cao Cao's army, they would be trapped. How could his elite troops and family escape? Guojia whispered that this was exactly where the problem lay. Given Lu Bu's personality, finding himself caught in such a trap should have made him desperate to save his own skin. One would expect him to focus only on taking his family and fleeing, yet the scouts had seen no sign of his relatives. Instead, Lu Bu was stubbornly prolonging the fight outside the gate, a detail that caused Cao Cao's expression to shift suddenly. He asked if Guojia meant that Lu Bu was intentionally stalling their main force and cavalry at the east gate. Was he simply waiting for reinforcements to arrive and save him? To be honest, it was a terrifying possibility. Guojia nodded, fearing this was the case, while a frowning Cao Cao considered who could actually come to Lu Bu's aid. Only Yuan Shu had the power to help, but even if he were willing, he couldn't move an army without being spotted. There were simply no other forces near Xiapi that Lu Bu could rely on, unless, and here the matter became far more complicated. Suddenly, a realization struck them both. Cao Cao and Guojia looked at each other and shouted the same name at once. That name was Zhang Liao. Just as the words left their lips, Cao Ren came galloping toward them in a state of sheer panic. He cried out that Zhang Liao had led 1,000 cavalrymen in a direct strike against their rear, and the men couldn't hold them back. Their formation was on the verge of total collapse, and Cao Cao realized with a heavy heart that Zhang Liao had completely outmaneuvered him. A sudden, cold fury washed over Cao Cao as he looked back on the entire campaign for Shuzhou. He kept repeating to his officers that Zhang Liao's interference was a mistake he should have seen coming. His anger flared again. This battle for Shuzhou was supposed to be his crowning achievement, not a chaotic retreat. We should remember that Cao Cao had 3 goals. First, to eliminate Lu Bu. Second, to seize all of Shuzhou. Third, he needed the support of the local elite to stabilize the region, and he had been so close to achieving it all. Deep down, he knew this crisis was his own fault for trying to recruit Zhang Liao instead of crushing him immediately. He felt a burning resentment toward Zhang Liao, but with the situation turning dire, he couldn't afford to dwell on his regrets. He ordered Eugene to lead the men in a fighting retreat back to the main camp, though Su Chu looked visibly reluctant. Su Chu argued that while Zhang Liao's cavalry was fierce, they were few in number compared to their own 10,000 soldiers. He believed that even if the east gate was weak, the troops from the other 3 gates could arrive in time to help. To Su Chu, retreating now seemed like a waste of a perfectly good victory, but Cao Cao simply shook his head. He pointed out that Gao Shun's Camp Crusher unit was far too powerful to be underestimated in a chaotic scramble. Their only advantage had been numbers, and without a solid formation, his men wouldn't dare to keep facing Lu Bu head-on. With Zhang Liao's 1,000 riders striking the rear, the units stationed at the other gates simply wouldn't make it back in time. If their main force broke now, a single misstep would put the entire main camp at risk of being overrun. And so, he decided the battle would end tonight, ordering Eugene to withdraw quickly since Lu Bu still lacked sufficient numbers. He reasoned that while the walls of Xiapi offered protection, Lu Bu would have nowhere to hide once he was out in the open. Even if Lu Bu managed to carry some grain with him, he wouldn't be able to survive for long in the wilderness. As long as Cao Cao's main army remained intact, Lu Bu would never retake Shuzhou, though deep down, he still hungered for his rival's head. But Cao Cao was a veteran of many wars, and he wasn't about to let a single setback lead to an even greater disaster. Seeing that Cao Cao had made up his mind, Cao Ren immediately galloped off to deliver the orders, and half an hour later, the city of Xiapi fell silent once more as the Cao army retreated as quickly as they had arrived, leaving only corpses behind. 10 miles west of the city, after over half an hour of frantic activity, most of the soldiers' families had finally made it out. To be honest, many of these families were actually women taken from common households back when Dongzhuo ravaged Luoyang. Some of these women were willing to follow their soldier husbands wherever they went, come what may. Others had taken advantage of the chaos to flee, while some were unfortunately killed by Cao Cao's troops during the breach. They simply couldn't get out in time. And of course, if one wants to survive a retreat from Cao Cao, rations are just as vital as men. And so, ignoring the exhaustion of the battle, Lu Bu personally led Gao Shun and Zhang Liao to secure the supplies. They worked tirelessly to move grain out of the city granaries, and as for the food they couldn't carry, Lu Bu ordered it all burned to the ground. Since he couldn't stay in Shuzhou anyway, he saw no reason to leave a feast behind. As for what the local citizens and the remnants of the Shuzhou army would eat, well, he decided to let Cao Cao worry about that. As the sky began to pale with the coming dawn and the supplies were ready, Lu Bu finally sent for Gao Shun. He told him to bring Chun Gong and Zhang Liao together for a meeting. After last night's defeat, Cao Cao's army was in no state to fight. At most, they would send scouts to track their movements, so there was no immediate rush to flee. A moment later, once everyone had gathered, Lu Bu spoke calmly, noting that a war between Cao Cao and Yuan Shao was inevitable. He explained that Cao Cao's goal in Shuzhou was to wipe them out and stabilize his rear before that larger conflict began. Although they had snatched a victory last night, we must remember that the enemy's numbers still far exceeded their own. Continuing a standoff offered no hope of total victory, so they had to leave Shuzhou. He then turned to Qin Gong for his thoughts. He asked where they should head next, following their original plan now that they had successfully broken the siege. Ideally, he wanted to take his soldiers back to Bingzhou, as the hostility from the Guangdong lords was simply too great. Perhaps returning home would provide some local support, but the journey from Shuzhou to Bingzhou was daunting. The distance was immense, and the idea of trekking thousands of miles through the territories of Cao Cao and Yuan Shao, well, that was little more than a pipe dream. Besides, Ding Yuan had died by his hand, a fact no one had forgotten. Given his current reputation, it was unlikely many would follow him anyway. Qin Gong then spoke up to offer his counsel. Looking at the current situation, he noted there were 3 paths for Lu Bu to choose from. Lu Bu nodded, telling him to proceed. He invited Gao Shun and Zhang Liao to listen in as well. Qin Gong explained that the first option was to cross the river to the east. By heading to Yangzhou, they could escape Cao Cao, whose power was still largely confined to the north of the river. He couldn't pose a real threat there yet, and since Lu Yao's death, the various lords in Yangzhou had been in constant conflict. While Sun Tzu's strength was growing, he hadn't yet managed to occupy the entire territory of Yangzhou. If they could find a way across, they could save their lives and perhaps even challenge Sun Tzu for control of the region. Yangzhou consisted of 6 commanderies. Currently, Zhejiang and Lujiang in the north were held by Yuan Shu. Sun Tzu had basically pacified Wu, Kuaiji, and Danyang, while Hua Xian, the governor of Yuzhong, stood alone and isolated. He had no power to resist Sun Tzu, so Yuzhong would inevitably fall into Sun Tzu's hands soon. As for Yizhou, it was simply too far away to have any real impact on the central plains. Lu Bu remained calm and asked for the other options. He wanted to know what the second and third paths were. Qin Gong continued, explaining that the second choice was to go and seek refuge with Yuan Shu. Though Yuan Shu seemed powerful, ever since he had declared himself emperor, he had lived a life of luxury, ignoring the suffering of his people and soldiers. His army was already beginning to desert him. Qin Gong predicted that Yuan Shu would fall within 2 years. If they joined him now, they might get a share of the spoils later. However, they had already had a major falling out with Yuan Shu, so he might not be willing to take them in at all. Furthermore, since Yuan Shu has already declared himself emperor, joining him might not be the wisest move for their reputation. Lu Bu mused that this man had taken a winning hand and played it quite poorly, if he remembered correctly. He recalled that Yuan Shu was destined to fall around the 4th year of Jianan. Joining him now might be a gamble. Perhaps they could seize a portion of his territory once he fell, but their history with Yuan Shu was complicated. As Qin Gong pointed out, even if they offered their service, there was no guarantee the man would even accept them. Feeling a bit of a headache coming on, Lu Bu asked for the third path. Qin Gong explained it involved a swift transit. They would need to cross Yuan Shu's lands quickly to reach Jingzhou and seek refuge with Lu Biao. Since Sun Jian's death, Lu Biao had become a sworn enemy to both Yuan Shu and Sun Tzu. Currently, Huangzu was stationed in Jiangxia, specifically to prevent Sun Tzu from looking north, while Zhang Xiu held Wanqing to block Cao Cao's southern advance. To the west of Jingzhou lay Shu, and since Lu Zhang was relatively weak, Lu Biao didn't worry much about that border. If they approached Lu Biao and offered to guard his eastern flank against Yuan Shu, he likely wouldn't refuse them. The only problem, of course, was whether Yuan Shu would actually let them pass through his lands peacefully. Ever since Yuan Shu declared himself emperor, he had become a social pariah, and Lu Biao, being royalty, despised him. Years ago, during the campaign against Dongzhou, Yuan Shu held the title of governor of Nanyang before Lu Biao forced him out. He was forced to migrate east, but despite that, Yuan Shu never truly gave up his ambitions for Jingzhou. As soon as the coalition against Dongzhou ended, Yuan Shu immediately sent Sun Jian to attack Jiangxia. Unfortunately, Sun Jian died during that campaign against Huangzu, and Yuan Shu's plans for Jingzhou fell apart. So, the two leaders were already at each other's throats. If Yuan Shu knew Lu Bu was heading to join his rival, He certainly wouldn't sit idly by. Yet, deep down, Lu Bu found himself favoring this third option from Qingong. Turning to his loyal commanders, Gao Shun and Zhang Liao, he asked for their thoughts. Gao Shun was the first to speak. Gao Shun spoke up, admitting he didn't grasp the grand politics of the world, but noted that most of their brothers were from Binzhou. He reminded Lu Bu that the world's lords viewed Yuan Shu as a common enemy, and Lu Bu himself had publicly broken ties with him. If they sought refuge with him now, Lu Bu might never be able to clear his name again. So, looking at the big picture, the commander felt that joining Lu Biao was the better path. Gao Shun was being quite direct here. When Yuan Shu declared himself emperor, Lu Bu had personally vowed that he and such a traitor could not live under the same sky. To join him now, just to survive, well, that would be a bit awkward for his reputation, wouldn't it? Zhang Liao then cupped his fists, agreeing that Lu Biao was the better choice. Lu Bu nodded, inviting Zhang Liao to speak his mind freely. We noticed that while Gao Shun and Qingong called him Lord, Zhang Liao still addressed him only as General. It seems he hadn't fully committed his heart to Lu Bu's cause just yet. But that was fine. The breakout last night had been a success, and there would be plenty of time to win him over later. Zhang Liao spoke solemnly, first addressing the path to Jiangdong. Currently, most of Yangzhou had fallen under the control of Sun Tzu. He described Sun Tzu as a man of great martial prowess and strategic vision, a formidable leader by any standard. Furthermore, Sun Tzu was backed by brilliant minds like Zhou Yu, Zhang Zhao, and Lu Su. If they went there just to survive, Sun Tzu might tolerate them, but if they tried to compete for control of Jiangdong, he would surely lead his armies against them immediately. He was simply no match for Sun Tzu. Cheng sighed, admitting that Wen Yuan was absolutely right and that he had been a bit thoughtless on this point. Zhang Liao gave a respectful nod to Qingong before continuing to the second path. Yuan Shu, he reminded them, was currently a rebel. Joining him would mean staining their own reputations forever. Besides, the Huainan region had been devastated by Yuan Shu's 4-year reign. The people were displaced, and the lands lay barren with few left to farm them. Even if he were willing to take them in, there was simply no future for them under Yuan Shu's command. Most importantly, the man had far too many enemies. If they joined him, they would likely be pushed to the front lines to take the hits for him, leaving them trapped and powerless. After a long silence, Lu Bu finally began to speak, his mind weighed down by the gravity of their next move. Since that is the case, we shall seek refuge with Lu Biao. However, before we set out, we must find a way to persuade him. He needs to be willing to accept us first. Lu Biao is not a soft-hearted man like Lu Zhang. If you want to join someone like him, you must at least obtain his consent beforehand. If we were to simply march our army into his territory without any notice, we would likely be crushed by his forces before even crossing the border. Qingong nodded in agreement with this assessment. The reason Lu Biao has been able to hold Jingzhou so securely, besides his own seasoned methods, is the support of the 4 great families. Specifically, the support of the Kai, Kuai, Huang, and Pang clans has been his foundation. It is said that Kai Mao is quite greedy and that there is constant infighting between him and the other 3 families. So, regarding our move to Jingzhou, perhaps we can start by approaching him. Kai Mao is certainly a character, as long as Lu Biao remains powerful. Kai Mao offers full support, sending money, grain, and even his own sister. Yet, the moment Lu Biao passes away, old Kai will likely defect to Cao Cao. Regardless of who rules Jingzhou, the Kai family's wealth and status never seem to fade. Lu Bu nodded, seeing the logic in this. He then requested Qingong to head to Jingzhou immediately. For the sake of safety, he decided to send a small escort. He ordered Chao Xing to take 10 elite guards to accompany him. As for the gold, silver, and treasures currently held in the treasury, Qingong was told he could take whatever he needed. Lu Bu recalled his time under Dong, which was command, where gold, pearls, and antiques were never in short supply. Consequently, the treasury in Xiapi was still overflowing with such things. As long as Kai Mao was willing to help persuade Lu Biao, Lu Bu wouldn't mind giving him half of it. Qingong bowed respectfully. He agreed to prepare for the journey to Jingzhou at once, but then he asked how Lu Bu planned to convince Yuan Shu to allow their army to pass through his lands. Lu Bu stood tall, noting that Yuan Shu was already like a withered tree. Since he had usurped the title of emperor, most of his generals had deserted him, leaving him with very few capable soldiers. After the recent defections of Chun Lan and Lei Bo, his remaining forces were even thinner. Lu Bu decided he would write a personal letter telling Yuan Shu they were heading to Jingzhou to join Zhang Xiu. If he tacitly allowed them to pass, then all would be well. But if he tried to block them, well, they would simply fight to the death. Besides, Shouchuan is still quite a distance from here. As long as we move our entire group together, even if Yuan Shu receives word and tries to mobilize troops to attack us, he likely won't catch up in time. We see that Zhang Xiu is essentially Lu Biao's watchdog in Wanqing, stationed there specifically to block Cao Cao's southern advance. Back in Luoyang and Chang'an, Lu Bu had some history with Zhang Ji and Zhang Xiu. To be honest, there was no real friendship there. However, Yuan Shu is unaware of that. Since they all served under the old tyrant Dong Zhuo, the idea of Lu Bu seeking refuge with them actually sounds somewhat plausible. Seeing that Lu Bu had made up his mind, Gao Shun immediately selected 10 elite swordsmen. He then escorted Gong and the treasures toward Xiangyang. Once they departed, Lu Bu sat down to write a personal letter. He ordered it sent to Shouchuan at top speed. Of course, sending a greeting to Yuan Shu was one thing, but there was no time to wait for a reply. If they didn't leave now, they would be trapped when Cao Cao's main army returned. So, immediately after the letter was sent, Lu Bu led Zhang Liao and the others westward. He knew Cao Cao had cavalry, but fortunately, they weren't many in number. The soldiers of the trap camp had no horses, and with the military families in tow, being caught by Cao Cao's main force would mean certain death. Meanwhile, in the Cao army camp east of Xiapi, despite their defeat the previous night, the scouts outside the city remained diligently at their posts. Consequently, the news of Lu Bu's escape reached Cao Cao's hands almost instantly. After a moment of quiet reflection, Cao Cao finally spoke to his advisors. According to the latest reports, Lu Bu is leading his defeated remnants westward. He asked them all to consider exactly where the man was planning to flee. Because Lu Bu had escaped, the battle for Shuzhou was not the total victory intended. Deep down, Cao Cao was naturally suppressed by a flicker of rage, but given the current situation and his temperament, he was more than capable of letting it go for now. The most critical question was whether to continue the pursuit. Cao Ren cupped his hands and noted that west of Xiapi lay the territories of Yuan Shu and Lu Biao. Lu Bu's journey meant he was either heading to join Yuan Shu or Lu Biao. Guo Jia then analyzed that Yuan Shu was notoriously fickle. Furthermore, because of the failed marriage between his son and Lu Bu's daughter, the two sides had completely fallen out. Therefore, Lu Bu likely wouldn't seek refuge with Yuan Shu. He would almost certainly head toward Lu Biao instead. We see that Lu Biao was a man who controlled 8 commanderies in Jingzhou, boasting a powerful army and loyal officials. Cao Cao noted grimly that if not for Yuan Shao and others causing trouble in the north, he would have dealt with Lu Biao long ago. Cao Ren then spoke up, asking what they should do if Lu Bu truly intended to join forces with Lu Biao. He requested permission to lead a pursuit immediately, determined to kill Lu Bu and eliminate the threat once and for all. In Cao Ren's eyes, as long as Lu Bu remained alive, he would eventually become a major thorn in the side of the Cao army. Cao Cao didn't agree to the proposal right away, turning instead to Sun Yu and Guo Jia to hear their thoughts. Sun Yu cupped his hands and admitted that he did not support continuing the military pursuit against Lu Bu. Cao Cao sighed, assuming the concern was that the freezing winter weather would make the army's progress difficult. He worried they couldn't catch up to Lu Bu's many cavalrymen, but Sun Yu shook his head, noting that while Lu Bu had horses, he also had the trapped camp, Zhang Liao's 1,000 infantry, and most importantly, the families of all his soldiers. These burdens would slow them down, meaning Cao Cao's infantry could likely catch them if they pushed hard enough. However, the advisor felt that their primary goal in this campaign was simply to bring the territory of Shuzhou under control. Once that was done, they could focus on governance. Since Lu Bu had left Shuzhou, there was no longer a need to hunt him. Besides, Lu Bu was currently fighting for his life like a cornered beast, and he would surely resist with everything he had. Even if their army managed to catch him, a bloody battle was inevitable, and after all that violence, there was still no guarantee they could actually hold him. If Lu Bu were still in Xiapi, Sun Yu would agree to finish him. But since he had already fled, even catching him wouldn't allow for a proper siege, only a chaotic skirmish. Losing soldiers and generals for such a result seemed pointless, as Lu Bu could always use his red hair to escape again. If Lu Bu truly decided to run, they simply wouldn't be able to catch him. To be honest, Sun Yu's analysis was quite logical, but Cao Cao still couldn't help but think. He felt a lingering sense of unwilling regret at the thought of failing to capture and kill his rival this time. Seeing Cao Cao looking at him with such high expectations, Guo Jia smiled and told his lord not to worry. Even if Lu Bu managed to escape to Jingzhou, it didn't mean they were completely out of options. Cao Cao looked thoughtful and asked what he meant. Guo Jia noted that Lu Bu's reputation had long since been dragged through the mud. He asked if his lord believed Lu Biao would truly welcome such a man. Cao Cao replied in a low voice that, under normal circumstances, Lu Biao would certainly be unwilling to take him in. After all, the betrayals of Ding Yuan and Dong Zhuo were still fresh in everyone's minds. However, we see that the world was currently in a state of chaos, and a warrior of Lu Bu's caliber was a rare find. If Lu Biao was ambitious enough, he might try to keep him as a guard dog at his gate, much like Zhang Xiu and Nanyang. Guo Jia nodded in agreement. He noted that his lord was exactly right. In these turbulent times of warring lords, Lu Biao might indeed accept Lu Bu's surrender to protect himself. It was very likely he would give him a small territory to act as a buffer zone against external threats, which, naturally, was a sound strategy. But all of this was based on the premise that Lu Bu had successfully broken out of Xiapi and was fleeing from their pursuit with nowhere else to go. What if Lu Biao believed that Lu Bu's arrival in Jingzhou was actually a trap, that they had let him go on purpose? Cao Ren frowned, noting that Lu Biao was already wary of their army. If he thought Lu Bu was a plant, he would surely be on high alert. He would either refuse to let Lu Bu enter with his troops, or pretend to take him in while secretly looking for a way to get rid of him. But the problem was that Lu Bu's escape was the genuine result of his own desperate struggle. Cao Ren felt it would be impossible to hide that truth. He argued that while Lu Biao hadn't intervened in the battle for Shuzhou, it didn't mean he wasn't watching the situation closely. Sending a few dozen spies from Xianyang to monitor the area around Xiapi wouldn't have been difficult at all. Guijiao laughed softly at this. He explained that Lu Biao's scouts could only see that Lu Bu had successfully broken through the siege. As for the specific details of the escape, they had no way of knowing the truth, and this was exactly where they could strike. Chao Ren still didn't quite catch the hidden meaning, but Cao Cao suddenly understood. He realized that Guijia was suggesting they intentionally stir up trouble and sow seeds of suspicion. He suggested they exploit the relationship between Lu Biao and Lu Bu by having Cao Cao personally write a letter to be sent to Xianyang. In this letter, he would tell Lu Biao that Lu Bu was one of the few true heroes left in the world, especially considering his past. He would claim that because of Lu Bu's merit in killing Dong Zhuo, Cao Cao couldn't bear to wipe him out during the Battle of Xiapi. Thus, he had intentionally left a path open for him to escape safely to Jingzhou. Once Lu Biao saw this, his view of the escape would change. Doubts would naturally begin to sprout regarding Lu Bu's arrival, and Lu Biao might even take the opportunity to kill him without them lifting a finger. Guojia nodded, calling it a classic strategy of sowing discord to kill with a borrowed sword, though he warned his lord not to hope for too much. After all, Lu Biao was no fool, and Lu Bu still had men like Chun Gong by his side who were certainly not lacking in strategic wit. So, even if Lu Biao received the letter, things might not go exactly as planned. Cao Cao laughed and decided they would proceed anyway. If Lu Biao killed Lu Bu, that would be ideal. If he didn't, our army wouldn't actually lose anything by trying. It was a win-win situation. The key was that while Lu Biao had some tolerance, it wasn't much. As long as a seed of suspicion was planted, Lu Bu would never find peace. In this campaign for Shuzhou, we see that Cao Cao had truly given his all. Now, the entire region was largely under his control. He told himself that while Lu Bu had fled to Jingzhou, the man wouldn't have the strength to return for revenge anytime soon. At this critical juncture, it was far more important to settle the affairs of Shuzhou and prepare the army to return to the capital. With the plan decided, Cao Cao immediately began writing to Lu Biao. We then move forward to the 27th day of the 12th lunar month. In Runan Commandery, after 2 days and a night of forced marching, Lu Bu finally arrived with the battered remnants of his defeated army. He had escaped Cao Cao's sphere of influence and reached Shaanxing County. Runan originally consisted of 37 counties under its jurisdiction. It was once a vast territory with a massive population, but unfortunately, it had been in decline ever since the Yellow Turban Rebellion. To make matters worse, after years of being ravaged by Yuan Shu, the population in the area had been reduced by at least half. The current governor of Runan, Sun Xiang, was a cousin of Sun Su, back when Sun Su broke ties with Yuan Shu in Jiangdong. His elders Wu Jing and Sun Bin had traveled thousands of miles in secret to Jiangdong to provide him with much-needed support. However, there was much gossip regarding why Sun Xiang, as Sun Su's cousin, had not yet gone to surrender to him. Some said the distance from Runan to Jiangdong was simply too great and that Yuan Shu had him under constant surveillance. Because of this, it was impossible to leave. Others whispered that Sun Xiang and Sun Su didn't actually get along at all. Furthermore, he was reluctant to give up his high office as governor, so he never truly intended to follow his cousin. At this moment, Lu Bu didn't care about such political details. After confirming there were no pursuers, he led his weary men forward. They found a deserted village to settle in temporarily. For days, they had been running from Cao Cao's army without rest. The soldiers hadn't eaten a single hot meal during the flight. Now, finally settled, some fetched water while others began to cook. The once silent village suddenly became bustling and noisy. Inside a well-preserved house, a meeting was taking place. We see Lu Bu and Zhang Liao sitting across from each other, carefully assessing the state of their remaining forces. Lu Bu asked how many fighting men they had left. Zhang Liao replied that he had already finished the count. There were roughly 2,600 soldiers remaining in the army. Among them were 503 elite warriors from the Camp Crusher unit. There were 1,170 cavalrymen and just under 1,000 infantry who, having avoided the main brunt of the fighting, suffered no losses. In addition to the soldiers, there were over 1,300 family members traveling with the army, most of whom were women. There were also a few children among them. During the battle outside Xiapi, Gao Shun's 800-man Camp Crusher unit had been hit hard. They had lost nearly 300 men, and among the 503 survivors, many were still nursing significant wounds. Zhang Liao's 1,000 cavalry, combined with the 600 riders under Ho Chung and Song Xian, had also suffered. They had lost nearly a third of their strength in a single engagement. As for the 3,000 Shuzhou troops from the city, they had all deserted. Hearing this report, Lu Bu couldn't help but grit his teeth in anger at Cao Cao. He swore he would settle this debt sooner or later. After a brief pause, he continued organizing his remaining strength. He decided that Gao Shun would continue to lead the Camp Crushers, while Zhang Liao would command the remaining cavalry and infantry. Lu Bu noted that the cavalry and the infantry should remain separate for now, asking Zhang Liao for his thoughts on the matter. Gao Shun was the very soul of the Camp Crushers. If he were moved, the unit's combat power would likely vanish instantly. As for the different branches, one couldn't simply pull a man from the infantry to replace a fallen rider. It just doesn't work that way. Zhang Liao cupped his fists in agreement, while Lu Bu turned his mind to their dwindling supplies of food and fodder. He wondered if they had enough to reach Jingzhou, especially in this freezing weather where horses needed to eat just as much as men. During the breakout, even knowing it might slow them down, he had been forced to carry extra fodder just to survive. When the topic of supplies came up, Zhang Liao couldn't help but look troubled, admitting they had very little food left. At most, they had enough for 2 or 3 days, and the fodder was even scarcer, no matter how much they rationed it. It was only enough for 2 full meals for the horses. Lu Bu pondered for a moment, asking about the garrison in Shaanxing County. Zhang Liao replied that the county seat had no more than 1,000 defenders, but there was a catch. After all, this was still Yuan Shu's territory. If they were to loot the county town, the news would eventually reach him. Ever since his last defeat by Cao Cao, Yuan Shu had been hiding in Shouchuan, seemingly too afraid to show his face. The journey from Renan to Shouchuan would take a fast horse 7 or 8 days for a round trip, a long time, to be sure. By the time Yuan Shu received word and mobilized, they would be long gone, and as for Sun Xiang's rabble, they were no threat. Lu Bu was certain they wouldn't dare block his path, as Yuan Shu's forces were scattered and disorganized at best. The elite troops were all in Shouchuan, while the governor of Renan, Sun Xiang, commanded only miscellaneous soldiers fit for keeping order. They were fine for dealing with bandits, but Sun Xiang certainly didn't have the courage to trade blows with a legend like Lu Bu. Zhang Liao saluted, promising to lead the troops to the county seat as soon as the men had finished their rest. Lu Bu nodded, instructing him to return immediately once the grain and fodder were secured so they could wait in this deserted village. They needed to see how Chun Gong's mission was progressing before moving further, at least until Lu Biao agreed to take them in. Although he felt confident in their success, he couldn't help but wonder what Lu Biao was actually thinking. It was still far too early to tell. If Lu Biao refused to take them in, and he simply rushed over anyway, he'd be walking straight into a trap, a fact Zhang Liao acknowledged with a nod. Zhang Liao asked if there were any other orders besides the food and fodder, to which Lu Bu replied that while they were heading to the county seat, their primary objective was indeed the supplies, but if they managed to take the town, there were other priorities to consider. He told them to avoid harming the innocent as much as possible and, almost as an afterthought, to bring back any blacksmiths they found in the city. Zhang Liao was slightly taken aback, pointing out that they didn't even have a proper camp in Shaanxing County to house such workers. Furthermore, the army had no ore or raw materials, so he wondered what use a few blacksmiths would be. To be honest, it was a fair question. In Zhang Liao's memory, whenever it came to raiding a city, Lu Bu's main concerns were usually the quality of the local wine, and which of the local women were the most beautiful. This sudden change in priorities, ignoring the wine entirely, seemed quite out of character. He wasn't asking for spirits, and he wasn't looking to seize any beauties. It was a strange day indeed. Lu Bu explained that if his new plans were to work, he needed to consult with professionals who understood the craft, so Zhang Liao was to find the skilled ones. Now, who doesn't love fine wine and wealth? But deep down, he knew the reality of their situation was far more precarious than before. The last night battle at Xiapi, where he had ordered Zhang Liao to support the breakout, had exhausted nearly all the goodwill between the two men. If he sent Zhang Liao to raid Shaanxing only to demand wine and women again, he suspected his general might just ride out of the village and never come back. Of course, bringing back blacksmiths actually served a practical purpose for the future of his cavalry. He had ideas for double-sided saddles and horseshoes that needed to be forged, though the current situation was still far too unstable for that. If he upgraded his equipment now, he'd likely just be handing it over to his enemies, so he didn't plan on a full production run just yet. He simply wanted to talk to the smiths first. Seeing that his lord's mind was made up, Zhang Liao saluted and accepted the command. We shift our gaze to the 29th day of the 12th lunar month in the 3rd year of Jianan, at the governor's mansion in Xiangyang. Years earlier, after Dong Zhuo was slain by Lu Bu, the warlords Li Ju and Guisi seized control of the court, seeking outside allies to secure their power. In the name of the emperor, Li Ju had appointed Lu Biao as general of the south and governor of Jingzhou, granting him authority over Jing, Yang, and Jiao provinces. However, Jiao was far too distant, and the territories of Yang province were already firmly held by Sun Su and Yuan Shu. Consequently, the land Lu Biao actually controlled was limited strictly to Jingzhou alone. Inside the main hall of the governor's mansion, we find Lu Biao seated alongside 3 of his most trusted advisors. Now, Lu Bu's reputation was already in tatters. Every warlord under heaven knew that his Fangtian halberd struck without loyalty. Faced with Lu Bu's sudden offer to join him, Lu Biao felt anything but secure, so he naturally sought counsel to weigh the risks. He needed to decide whether to accept the man or turn him away. Among those present was his strategist, Kai Mao, a native of Xiangyang. Since Kai Mao's elder sister had married Lu Biao as his second wife, this family tie made the governor rely on him even more heavily. Another advisor was Kuai Yu, the prefect of Zhongling. Years ago, when Lu Biao first entered Jingzhou alone on horseback, The two brothers, Kuai Liang and Kuai Yu, had provided immense help to repay their loyalty once he secured the province. Lu Biao appointed Kuai Liang as his chief aide and Kuai Yu as the prefect of Zhongling, one of the 8 commanderies of Jingzhou. The third man was Lu Xian, a scholar from Lingling known for his vast memory and knowledge of classic precedents. He served as Lu Biao's deputy. Meanwhile, Lu Bu's messenger had arrived in Xiangyang with bags of gold and jewels under Gao Shun's escort. Influenced by the weight of those treasures, Kai Mao had decisively agreed to act as a lobbyist for Lu Bu's cause. He intended to persuade Lu Biao to accept the defection, but the governor felt the matter was far too significant to decide alone. He insisted on a thorough discussion, which is why he brought Kuai Yu and Lu Xian into the debate. Kai Mao began his persuasion. He argued that after the defeat at Xiapi, Lu Bu was nothing more than a rootless wanderer with fewer than 3,000 men. With only generals like Zhang Liao and Gao Shun left, Kai Mao claimed such a small force couldn't possibly pose a threat to them. Furthermore, he suggested that if the governor showed the magnanimity to take in a desperate hero, other warriors would surely flock to his banner. However, Lu Xian interjected coldly, noting that Lu Bu possessed the heart of a wolf and a reputation that had long since rotted. Lu Xian argued that if the Lord truly took him in, the heroes of the world would see them as nothing more than birds of a feather with Lu Bu. Besides, he noted that Lu Biao and Cao Cao were already mortal enemies, and taking Lu Bu in so rashly would only worsen things. Cao Cao would undoubtedly view their army with even greater hostility, making the risk of offending him just to accept Lu Bu a heavy burden. He questioned if the weight of this choice was truly so hard to see, noting that Kai Mao had no real friendship with Lu Bu to justify such effort. It was obvious that Kai Mao had secretly accepted bribes, but because of his family ties to Lu Biao, the matter was delicate. Lu Xian simply couldn't bring such accusations out into the open, so Kai Mao shook his head, claiming his colleague was mistaken. Kai Mao argued that since Cao Cao had already led his army to attack Nanyang, a grudge already existed regardless of Lu Bu's presence. That fact wouldn't change, and since Lu Bu was one of the world's rare elite generals, giving him a place to stay had its benefits. He could serve as a protective shield on Jingzhou's outer borders, especially now that Yuan Shu was on the verge of total collapse. By stationing Lu Bu in eastern Jingzhou, they could use him as a vanguard to seize the lands of Yangzhou once Yuan Shu finally fell. Now, Kai Mao had an old acquaintance with Cao Cao and didn't actually want Jingzhou to completely break ties with him. However, for Cao Cao to focus on Yuan Shao, he first had to deal with Zhang Xiu and Nanyang, which complicated matters significantly. Since Zhang Xiu was essentially a watchdog kept by Lu Biao and Nanyang to guard against Cao Cao, the conflict was unavoidable. Therefore, the dispute between Lu Biao and Cao Cao was fundamentally impossible to mediate, despite Kai Mao's personal connections. Even so, Kai Mao was careful not to do anything too extreme in front of Lu Biao, at least not on the surface. He had to maintain the appearance that everything he did was for the good of Jingzhou, though Lu Xian remained unconvinced. Lu Xian admitted the plan sounded fine in theory, but Lu Bu was not a man who could be easily controlled or manipulated. He reminded them of the fates of Ding Yuan and Dong Zhuo, warning that bringing Lu Bu to Jingzhou was like inviting a disaster. Kai Mao bowed to Lu Biao, arguing that times had changed since Lu Bu's betrayals of Ding Jianyang and Dong Zhuo. Back then, his betrayals were fueled by massive ambition and his great prestige among the Bingzhou and Liangzhou armies, but things were different now. Kai Mao argued that Jingzhou was already as solid as an iron barrel, and since Lu Bu had no foundation among their troops, he had no way to cause any real trouble. Lu Biao remained calm and turned to ask for Yidu's opinion on Lu Bu's request to join them, speaking with the measured tone of a true provincial lord. After all, Xiangyang was a stronghold he had built with his own hands. It was impossible for him to be unaware of what was happening within its walls. We see that Lu Biao had known for some time that Chun Gong and Gao Shun had gone straight to Kai Mao's estate upon entering the city. He simply didn't want to confront Kai Mao directly, considering the Kai family was his most vital pillar of support. Besides, Kai Mao was his brother-in-law. As long as he didn't commit outright treason, Lu Biao was willing to overlook a few bribes. To be honest, it was a practical choice. Kuai Yu then spoke up, noting that Kai Mao was right about one thing. Their relationship with Cao Cao's army was already beyond repair. Since they had nothing left to lose with Cao Cao, he suggested they could indeed accept Lu Bu into their ranks. However, he cautioned against settling him in eastern Jingzhou. Lu Biao looked thoughtful and asked Kuai Yu to explain his reasoning. Kuai Yu pointed out that Jingzhou remained stable under the Lord's rule because the people were hardworking, the weather was favorable, and bandits were kept at bay. The situation was balanced and interests were shared, but eastern Jingzhou consisted of Zhongling and Jiangxia commanderies, which complicated things. He argued that placing Lu Bu in Zhongling would feel like a thorn in their side, while placing him in Jiangxia would send the wrong message. The local commander, Huangzu, would surely wonder if the Lord was dissatisfied with him and was using Lu Bu to replace or monitor him. Most importantly, eastern Jingzhou bordered Yuan Shu's territory, and they had to consider what would happen once Yuan Shu finally collapsed. He asked if Lu Bu, after acting as a vanguard to seize those lands, would truly be honest enough to hand them over to the Lord. It was a fair question. Hearing this analysis, Kai Mao felt a surge of secret resentment. Though he kept his face perfectly masked, he knew Lu Bu's true intentions. Lu Bu clearly wanted to use Jingzhou's resources to recover his strength while waiting for the perfect moment to strike out on his own. He was waiting for Yuan Shu's downfall just to grab a piece of the pie for himself, a fact that Kai Mao understood all too well. However, Jiangxia was Huangzu's domain, and Lu Biao still needed him to fend off the little conqueror of Jiangdong, Sun Tzu. Therefore, Lu Bu certainly wouldn't be sent to Jiangxia, and Zhongling was within the Huai family's sphere of influence, which explains Huai Yu's concern. This was a subtle move to suppress the Huai family's influence. The smaller their power grew, the larger the Kai family's dominance in Jingzhou became. This was Kai Mao's true intention all along. After all, the gold and silver treasures sent by Chun Gong wouldn't have been enough on their own. How could those gifts alone convince him to help? Lu Biao shot a dissatisfied glance at Kai Mao before turning to ask Huai Yu for his opinion. He asked where would be the most appropriate place to settle Lu Bu, well aware of the constant infighting among the four great families of Jingzhou. Lu Biao couldn't fully reconcile their disputes. As long as they didn't overstep and threaten his position as lord, he was content to let it be. Huai Yu bowed and suggested that, given the current situation, the best course of action after accepting Lu Bu would be to send him to Nanyang Commandery. Lu Xian frowned, noting that Zhang Xiu was currently stationed there with his troops. It was a valid concern, to be sure. He worried that if Lu Bu were sent there as well, the two might end up fighting each other. After all, Nanyang Commandery was a critical location. It served as their front line against Cao Cao's army. If Lu Bu and Zhang Xiu clashed, Cao Cao might seize the chance to march south. Lu Xian hailed from Linling, and his family's influence was rooted in the Jiangnan region, far from the immediate reach of the central power. In Xiangyang, he watched the power struggles between the Kai, Huai, Huang, and Pang families with a cold, detached eye. It was quite the spectacle. As a high-ranking official, Lu Xian felt a deep responsibility toward Lu Biao. Huai Yu smiled and noted that Yuan Shao had already consolidated his power. With 3 provinces under his belt, if Yuan Shao defeated Gongsun Zan, he would control 4 provinces and set his sights on the land south of the river. Once those reinforcements crossed the river, Cao Cao's territory would be the first to fall. Since withdrawing from Shuzhou, Cao Cao had been cornered. He had no choice but to focus all his energy on preparing for Yuan Shao, meaning he wouldn't dare to march south again in the short term. Secondly, he argued that Lu Bu was fundamentally untrustworthy. Even if they took him in, they couldn't allow him to stay in the heart of Jingzhou. A city like Xianyang was far too important. Looking at the map, Nanyang Commandery was the only place left with room for him to settle. As for the third point, Zhang Xiu had already surrendered to Cao Cao once before. He was a man known for playing both sides when it suited him. Sending Lu Bu to Nanyang would serve as a perfect check against him. Since both had limited troops, they couldn't cause too much trouble. No matter how much they bickered, they couldn't escape the Lord's control. Meanwhile, the Kai family remained the most powerful clan in all of Jingzhou. Furthermore, Kai Mao was Lu Biao's brother-in-law. Although Huai Yu was dissatisfied with him in front of Lu Biao, he couldn't afford to be too arrogant. So, regarding Kai Mao's poisonous scheme, he simply redirected the trouble elsewhere. His plan was to simply drop Lu Bu in Nanyang Commandery. Lu Biao, having no intention of retaliating against Kai Mao, spoke in a deep voice. He noted that both Lu Bu and Zhang Xiu had served under Dong Zhuo. Even if they weren't close, they were at least acquaintances. He worried that if Lu Bu went to Nanyang, he might actually join forces with Zhang Xiu. Huai Yu simply shook his head at this. He argued that a man like Lu Bu would never submit to another. He would never accept Zhang Xiu as his master. And Zhang Xiu had been in Nanyang a long time. With at least 3 times the military strength of Lu Bu, it was equally impossible for Zhang Xiu to follow Lu Bu's lead. Additionally, during the Great Battle of Chang'an, the two had actually fought against each other. Even if they did unite, they wouldn't truly become a single, cohesive force. After weighing Huai Yu's points, Lu Biao finally made up his mind. He decided to let Lu Bu lead his army to Nanyang. But just as Lu Biao was about to announce this decision, a guard suddenly entered from outside to report that a handwritten letter from Cao Cao had just arrived. After taking the letter from the guard's hand, Lu Biao immediately began to read it in a hurry. Kai Mao grew curious about the contents. Seeing the strange expression on Lu Biao's face after he finished reading, Kai Mao couldn't help but ask what Cao Cao had written. Lu Biao replied that Cao Cao claimed Lu Bu escaped Xiapi only because Cao Cao appreciated his merit in killing Dong Zhuo. Supposedly, he had intentionally spared his life. After a brief pause, Lu Biao continued with the rest of the message. Cao Cao wrote that Lu Bu was one of the world's great heroes, and since he intended to settle in Jingzhou, he asked them to take good care of him. Huai Yu laughed, wondering when exactly Cao Cao, or Cao Amon as he called him, had become such close friends with Lu Bu. He remarked that this was nothing more than Cao Cao's attempt to kill with a borrowed knife, and that the Lord should simply ignore it. It was obvious that both sides had fought with everything they had during the Battle of Xiapi. It seemed Cao Cao simply didn't understand how it happened. In the end, he had simply failed to stop Lu Bu from leading his army through the breakthrough. A bit embarrassing for him, really. He argued that Cao Cao had written this letter specifically to make Lu Biao suspicious of Lu Bu, hoping he would simply execute him. Lu Biao noted in a deep voice that Cao Cao was famously cunning, and his advisors, Guo Jia and Sun Yu, were brilliant strategists. He knew they were aware that this killing with a borrowed knife trick was obvious, and yet they sent the letter anyway. This led Lu Biao to wonder if there was a possibility that Cao Cao really had let Lu Bu go on purpose. Perhaps the goal was to let Lu Bu stir up chaos in Jingzhou. Cai Mao shook his head, telling his lord he was overthinking it. He insisted that Cao Cao's ultimate goal in besieging Xiapi was to eliminate Lu Bu entirely. If Lu Bu lived, he could make a comeback at any time and threaten Xuzhou. Therefore, Cao Cao would never willingly let him escape. We see that Lu Biao was just as suspicious as Cao Cao, but with one fatal flaw. Cao Cao was decisive in his doubt. Lu Biao, on the other hand, became paralyzed by it. Cai Mao's single argument wasn't enough to clear the fog in his mind. Seeing Lu Biao turn his gaze back toward him, Huai Yu thought for a moment before bowing and addressing his lord. He stated that Cai Mao's view was correct. Cao Cao couldn't catch Lu Bu himself, so he chose to muddy the waters. By doing so, he hoped to manipulate Lu Biao's intentions and cloud his judgment. He wanted to use Lu Biao's army to do his dirty work. If the lord believed the lie, Cao Cao would certainly be pleased. And if the lord didn't believe his nonsense, well, Cao Cao had lost nothing by trying. Lu Xian bowed as well. He agreed, noting that while Lu Bu had been defeated, he still led at least 3,000 battle-hardened soldiers. If they tried to crush Lu Bu now, even a victory would cost them thousands of their own troops. It was clear that Cao Cao's letter was full of hidden malice, designed to make them fight Lu Bu while he watched from the sidelines. With all three advisors in agreement, Lu Biao finally began to relax. He then asked if Lu Bu's strategist, Chen Gong, had already arrived in Xiangyang. Cai Mao confirmed that Chen Gong was in the city, currently staying at his own residence. Lu Biao nodded and gave a secret order to have Chen Gong brought for an audience after nightfall. Lu Bu's reputation was truly troublesome. Since Chen Gong had come as an envoy, Lu Biao knew it was impossible to receive him in front of all the officials at the governor's manor. Such matters were best handled in a private meeting, so Cai Mao immediately bowed and accepted the order. It was now the second day of the first lunar month. In a deserted village outside Shaanxing County, Zhang Liao led his troops toward the city, and the local magistrate naturally didn't dare to block his path. After they entered the city, the situation became quite tense for the local authorities. The magistrate couldn't withstand Lu Bu's fearsome reputation or the pressure from Zhang Liao's generals, so he gritted his teeth and found a way to provide supplies. He managed to scrape together a portion of grain and fodder to hand over. Once the supplies were secured, Zhang Liao didn't trouble him any further. He immediately led the troops away. In the wild outskirts of Shaanxing County, there was absolutely nothing interesting to do to pass the time. And so, we find Lu Bu pulling Zhang Liao aside to discuss the heroic figures of Jingzhou. Back in the era of Emperor Ling, Lu Hong, Jingzhou consisted of 7 commanderies, including Nanjun, Nanyang, and Jiangxia to the north of the river. To the south were Guiyang and Changsha. After Lu Biao took charge of Jingzhou, the administrative landscape shifted slightly. He established a new commandery between Nanyang and Jiangxia, known as Zhongling Commandery. Huai Yu, the second most powerful figure in the Huai family, served as its first governor. Because Lu Bu was a traveler from another time, he didn't actually know much about the finer details of the situation in Jingzhou. Fortunately, however, Zhang Liao was quite well informed. Zhang Liao remarked with a sigh that Jingzhou was a land of constant conflict, having seen many battles since the chaos of the warlords began. It was only after Lu Biao took control that the situation finally began to stabilize. To be honest, it was a rare moment of peace for the region. Regarding the prominent families of Jingzhou, we have Cai Mao, the head of the Cai family, and the 2 Huai brothers, Huai Liang and Huai Yu. Then there were figures like Lord Pangde of the Pang family and Huang Qingyan of the Huang family, all top-tier individuals of their time. As for military commanders, Lu Biao had Huang Zu of Jiangxia, General Zhang Yu, and the brave Wen Pin under his command. These were all formidable heroes in their own right. As long as Lu Biao remained in power, the 4 great families would be difficult to win over. The real reason Lu Bu brought up these figures to Zhang Liao, however, was that he was desperate for news of Zhuge Liang and Pang Tong. After all, if we look at the timeline, Liu Bei hadn't managed to recruit either of them yet. Lu Bu spoke up, breaking the silence. He asked Zhang Liao if he had ever heard of Mr. Water Mirror, Sima Hui, or the legendary names of Sleeping Dragon and Fledgling Phoenix. Zhang Liao replied that he had indeed heard of Sima Hui, a man from Yinchuan who was a close friend of Lord Pangde. Since Lu Biao had opened an academy in Xiangyang, Sima Hui had been invited to lecture there, so he was likely in the city. However, as for the titles of Sleeping Dragon and Fledgling Phoenix, the general admitted he had never heard of them before. It was currently only the 4th year of Jianan, and since Liu Bei wouldn't join Lu Biao for another 2 years, this was perfectly normal. He told himself it wasn't too late to ask around once they reached Jingzhou. He then asked about the figures in the southern regions. Zhang Liao had mentioned figures from the Jiangbei area, but what about the 4 commanderies of Jingnan, south of the river? That area was also full of hidden talent. To be honest, legends like Huangzhong and Wei Yin should be stationed somewhere around there. Zhang Liao explained that the river acted as a barrier, meaning news from the 4 southern commanderies didn't travel to the north very often. Because of this, he didn't know much, though he had heard that Zhang Xian, the governor of Changsha, was defying Liu Biao. Zhang Xian had raised a rebellion, but because of the freezing winter weather, Liu Biao had decided not to send troops just yet. If Zhang Liao's guess was correct, Liu Biao would likely mobilize a massive army to suppress Zhang Xian once spring arrived. Lu Bu pondered this for a moment, wondering if Cao Cao had intentionally sent agents to incite Zhang Xian's rebellion. Zhang Liao nodded, noting it was highly likely. If Cao Cao wanted to focus on Yuan Shao, he needed to keep Jingzhou occupied. If Zhang Xian could tie down the majority of Liu Biao's forces in the south, it would certainly be a development Cao Cao would welcome. While Liu Biao used Zhang Xiu and Nanyang to block Cao Cao's path south, Cao Cao was busy sending secret agents to the southern regions. He was using Zhang Xian to stab Liu Biao in the back. Keeping track of all these schemes was enough to make anyone's head spin. He realized that once they reached Jingzhou, he would need to find a way to recruit more strategists and generals as quickly as possible. Zhang Liao remained silent for a moment before asking if the general had any long-term plans for their stay in Jingzhou. To be honest, Zhang Liao had never truly approved of Lu Bu's past actions, even when he rode out to the rescue outside Xiapi. That had been a final act of duty as a subordinate, but the future was different. He needed to know if going to Jingzhou was merely a retreat. If the plan was simply to live as Liu Biao's lapdog just to survive, Zhang Liao admitted he had no desire to follow any further. Lu Bu pondered this for a moment before speaking slowly, acknowledging that survival was indeed the most immediate goal of this journey. The world was no longer the chaotic free-for-all of the early warlord era. Now, every piece of land had a clear and powerful master. Since the defeat at Xiapi, they were left with no other path but Jingzhou, a fact that forced a bitter smile from Zhang Liao. But he worried that once they arrived, Liu Biao would watch them day and night, using them as nothing more than a disposable blade. He feared they would be treated like dogs at the gate, making it impossible to build their own power, but Lu Bu only laughed. He agreed that Liu Biao would certainly try to guard against them, but his methods and abilities were far inferior to those of Cao Cao. While they couldn't handle Cao Cao yet, Lu Bu felt there would be plenty of opportunities to outmaneuver Liu Biao, sparking Zhang Liao's curiosity. The general asked if a plan was already in motion, and Lu Bu nodded, explaining that the second step after arriving was recruitment. They needed to gather as many strategists and generals as possible while finding ways to quietly expand their own military strength. Of course, this required a delicate balancing act. They couldn't afford to grow too slowly, lest they remain weak and irrelevant. Yet, they couldn't let Liu Biao perceive them as a threat either. If they managed that, they could proceed to the third step. With a solemn expression, Zhang Liao asked what that third step entailed, noting how much Lu Bu's character had changed since their escape. The most obvious change was that Lu Bu was finally willing to listen to reason, a rare quality in their line of work, to be sure. If he could maintain this state of mind, Zhang Liao felt that stabilizing their position and recruiting talent wouldn't be an impossible task. Lu Bu's voice grew deep as he revealed the third step. When the timing was right, he intended to move toward the southern regions of Jingzhou. His goal was to break free from Liu Biao's constraints entirely and seize control of the 4 southern commanderies for themselves. Zhang Liao noted that while those 4 commanderies were stable, their population was limited and they bordered the harsh wilds of Jiaozhou. To the north lies the surging Yangtze, to the east is Sun Tzu's territory, and to the west, the vast, impassable mountains. It is a land that traps dragons. Even if we could occupy it, Zhang Liao wondered aloud what could truly be achieved. Lu Bu smiled, noting that while Zhang Liao saw a trap, he saw a place where, with the right plan, they could soar. Zhang Liao pondered this for a moment before shaking his head, asking the general to explain his vision more clearly. Though Zhang Liao was a top-tier commander, he was still limited by the perspective of his era regarding the grander stage. Lu Bu pointed out that southern Jingzhou bordered Yizhou, where the ruler, Lu Zhang, was famously incompetent. If they could build their strength in those 4 southern commanderies and then seize an opening to enter Shu, things would change. He asked if that wouldn't be considered soaring. Zhang Liao admitted that entering Shu would indeed offer massive potential. However, he feared that neither Liu Biao of Jingzhou nor Sun Tzu of Jiangdong would simply stand by and watch it happen. With a chuckle, Lu Bu offered a wager, leaving Zhang Liao quite puzzled as to what his commander had in mind. When asked what the stakes were, Lu Bu noted it was the 4th year of Jianan and bet on the life of Sun Tzu. If Sun Tzu died within 2 years, Lu Bu won, and Zhang Liao would have to serve him with an undivided heart from then on. But if Sun Tzu was still alive after the 6th year of Jianan, Lu Bu lost, and Zhang Liao would be free to leave with his troops. Lu Bu promised not to stop him. He knew a man of Zhang Liao's resolve couldn't be forced to follow against his will. While some matters could be glossed over with vague promises, Lu Bu realized this was not one of those times. He truly wanted to earn Zhang Liao's loyalty, which is why he proposed such a specific and daring wager. Seeing Lu Bu so certain of Sun Tzu's impending death, Zhang Liao frowned, wondering if the general planned an assassination. He reasoned that if Sun Tzu fell, the newly unified Jiangdong would surely crumble into chaos and internal strife. This would allow their forces in the south to take advantage of the vacuum, but Lu Bu quickly shook his head at the idea. Assassination was a low-handed trick, he claimed. His certainty about Sun Tzu's fate didn't require them to lift a finger. Zhang Liao was deeply confused, noting that the general predicted Sun Tzu's death within 2 years while claiming he wouldn't lift a finger. He wondered aloud if there was actually any force left in the Jiangdong region capable of taking Sun Tzu down. We see Lu Bu explain that while Jiangdong has many heroes, Sun Tzu's ruthless nature in battle has created a dangerous reputation. He pointed out that Sun Tzu is overly confident in his own martial skill, often traveling with very light armor and minimal fanfare. There are times he doesn't even bring his personal bodyguards, despite having countless enemies in Jiangdong who want him dead. With a proper plan, the possibility of a successful strike is quite high, a point Lu Bu asked Zhang Liao to consider. Sun Tzu is a pivotal figure in the East, and to be honest, Lu Bu seemed to understand his character better than anyone. He recalled that Sun Tzu's ultimate fate involved being ambushed by the retainers of Su Gong during a simple hunting trip. Zhang Liao remained silent for a moment before asking about Lu Biao, who sat in Jingzhou with tens of thousands of elite troops. He argued that Lu Biao would never simply stand by and watch their army take control of the southern Jingzhou region. While Sun Tzu was brave, the Sun family's roots in Jiangdong were still shallow, making them vulnerable to the local elite. If those powerful families sought revenge for being sidelined, Sun Tzu could indeed fall to a well-placed ambush. But Lu Biao was a different story. His defenses in Jingzhou were tight, making any assassination attempt nearly impossible. As the governor of Jingzhou, it was simply unthinkable that he would allow another power to divide his territory. Lu Bu laughed, agreeing that Lu Biao certainly wouldn't want them consolidating power in the south just to swallow the Shu region later. It was a bold plan, and naturally, the obstacles ahead were as vast as the mountains themselves. Zhang Liao sighed, admitting the strategy was persuasive but required a level of brilliance that seemed almost unreachable. He doubted if even their own strategist could pull off such a feat, a sentiment Lu Bu surprisingly agreed with. He noted that Qin Gong was too upright and often refused to use the kind of underhanded schemes necessary for this goal. However, we mustn't forget that the world's finest minds, like Zhuge Liang and Pang Tong, are right there in Jingzhou. These men are among the top strategists of the Three Kingdoms, but at this point, Zhang Liao hadn't even heard of them yet. When the topic of first-rate strategists in Jingzhou came up, he looked puzzled and asked if the general meant the Kuai brothers. Lu Bu noted that while Kuai Liang and Kuai Yu were certainly capable, their talents were limited to managing a single province. Perhaps if the chessboard were larger, they might have grown, but they weren't quite ready for the grand stage of the world. As for the top-tier strategist Lu Bu had in mind, he revealed that Zhang Liao actually knew the man quite well. Suddenly, it clicked for Zhang Liao, and he asked with a look of realization if the general was referring to Jia Su. Indeed, it was Jia Su, a man from Wuwei who had entered service early on through the recommendation system. He later became a key strategist for the Liangzhou army under Dong Zhuo, right up until Lu Bu killed the tyrant. With Dong Zhuo gone, the Liangzhou army was leaderless and chaotic, while court officials led by Wang Yun began seeking revenge. Men like Li Ju and Guosi felt that since their leader was dead, there was no way to keep the army together anymore. They thought it best to simply flee back to their hometowns in Liangzhou, which, to be honest, seemed like a sensible retreat. However, Jia Su stood against the crowd and immediately shut down the plans of Li Ju and Guosi with a clear warning. He reminded them that since following Dong Zhuo, the Liangzhou army had burned and looted everything from Luoyang to Chang'an. Even the imperial tombs in Luoyang had been desecrated on Dong Zhuo's orders, leaving the court with no reason to show mercy. If they retreated now, their soldiers would lose heart and scatter, leaving them vulnerable to being hunted down one by one. To survive, they had to gather the defeated troops and launch a counterattack on Chang'an, a bold and desperate move. Only by seizing control of the court could they protect their lives and prevent the total destruction of the Liangzhou region. Without a doubt, Jia Su's ruthless strategy was a success, and we see Li Ju and Guosi successfully retake the capital. Even after Dong Zhuo's death, they managed to maintain control over the imperial court for another 3 or 4 years. Had it not been for the fierce infighting between Li Ju, Guosi, and Fan Chou, they might have repeated Dong Zhuo's reign entirely. But while Jia Su's strategy to retake Chang'an was a blessing for the Liangzhou army, for the common people, and the court, it was an absolute catastrophe, and it was through this chaos that his reputation as the poisoner began to spread. Zhang Liao remained silent for a moment before noting that Jia Su was currently serving under Zhang Xiu, a former rival. He reminded the general that they had fought against Zhang Xiu's kin during the Chang'an conflict, making Jia Su's loyalty unlikely. Furthermore, he worried that recruiting a man with such a dark reputation might cause the world's heroes to criticize Lu Bu. Lu Bu simply replied that they would find a way to win Jia Su over once they reached Jingzhou, one step at a time. As for the criticism from other heroes, he dismissed it entirely, asking Zhang Liao if he truly thought his own reputation was any better. Zhang Liao couldn't help but chuckle, realizing he had indeed been overthinking things. Lu Bu's reputation was already quite complicated. With that settled, he agreed to follow the general's lead, just as a messenger arrived with an urgent letter from Xiangyang. After quickly scanning the contents, Lu Bu turned to Zhang Liao and gave the order to move out toward Nanyang Commandery. Zhang Liao was confused, as he had expected them to head toward Jiangxia or Nanling instead of Nanyang. Lu Bu explained in a low voice that while Lu Biao had agreed to take them in, he refused to let them stay in eastern Jingzhou. The only option offered was Nanyang, which, as Zhang Liao pointed out with some concern, was already occupied by Zhang Xiu. He feared an immediate conflict, but Lu Bu only smiled, seemingly unbothered by the prospect of a little friction. He remarked that chaos is a ladder and they would face whatever came their way. Besides, Jiasu was waiting for them there. And so, in the first month of the 4th year of Jinan, we find ourselves in the city of Wanqing. Inside the study of the governor's manor, Zhang Xiu was looking quite grim as he discussed matters with Jiasu. There were 36 county seats in all, with the commandery seat being Wancheng, where Zhang Xiu was currently stationed, the very place where Emperor Guangwu, Lu Xiu, had founded his empire. Back when Emperor Guangwu founded the dynasty, 11 of his 28 great generals hailed from this very region. Because of this, Nanyang was known as the southern capital, and at its peak, it housed over 520,000 households. At its height, nearly 2.5 million people lived here, but unfortunately, after the Yellow Turban Rebellion and the ensuing chaos of the warring lords, Nanyang suffered a devastating blow. The common folk either perished or fled, and the region's former glory became a distant memory. In the first year of Jinan, Zhang Ji led his massive army into this territory. Many came to offer congratulations when he fell, saying Zhang Ji was merely a Liangzhou bandit who brought his own death upon himself. However, Lu Biao disagreed, remarking that Zhang Ji was a hero in his own right and that his death in Jingzhou was a tragedy. He claimed it wasn't a spectacle he wished to see, accepting only condolences rather than praise after Zhang Ji's passing. Lu Biao then repeatedly sent messengers to show goodwill toward Zhang Xiu, who, facing a food shortage and moved by the gesture, made a decision. He simply went with the flow and surrendered to Lu Biao, though any keen observer could see that the relationship between them was nothing more than a calculated business transaction. Zhang Xiu intentionally carved out a dozen counties from Nanyang to create a new district for his own loyal followers to manage. He and Lu Biao were merely using each other, and to be honest, they could hardly be considered to have a true master-servant relationship. This is why, in the second year of Jinan, when Cao Cao led his army south, Zhang Xiu decisively chose to surrender to him instead. Regrettably, Cao Cao grew arrogant after the surrender, even forcing Zhang Ji's widow to serve him to satisfy his own ego. This naturally infuriated Zhang Xiu, leading him to revolt once more in a sudden and bloody surprise attack. While Cao Cao himself managed to escape, his eldest son Cao Ong, his nephew Cao Anmin, and the fierce General Dian Wei all perished at Zhang Xiu's hands, leaving Cao Cao with a hatred for the man that reached his very bones. So, in the third year of Jinan, a recovered Cao Cao once again led his forces south to crush Zhang Xiu in a massive campaign. Although Cao Cao defeated the allied forces of Zhang Xiu and Lu Biao, he failed to capture the strategic stronghold of Wanqing. He was forced to withdraw his troops once more, eventually turning his attention toward attacking Lu Bu and Xuzhou. Only then did Zhang Xiu find a moment of peace, never imagining that Lu Bu would survive and be sent by Lu Biao directly to Nanyang. What do you think Lu Biao is planning by sending Lu Bu here to Nanyang? Zhang Xiu asked, his voice heavy with worry. Could it be that he wants to use Lu Bu to swallow us whole? Jiasu shook his head calmly. Don't worry, General. Lu Bu's arrival here is most likely just Lu Biao's way of using him as a shield against Cao Cao. He would never actually allow Lu Bu to absorb your forces. Compared to Zhang Xiu, Lu Bu was far more difficult to control. If he were allowed to take over Zhang Xiu's army and the entire Nanyang region, his ambition would surely drive him to find a way to seize all of Jingzhou. Zhang Xiu might be stubborn, but he lacked that level of dangerous greed. Most importantly, since Cao Ong, Cao Anmin, and Dian Wei all died at Zhang Xiu's hands, there was no turning back. Because of that blood feud, he and Cao Cao could never reconcile. Thus, Lu Biao had no reason to strike at Zhang Xiu just yet. Zhang Xiu frowned, noting that Lu Bu was a man of wolf-like ambition. He had first served Ding Yuan only to kill him, then did the same to Dong Zhuo. He killed his masters whenever it suited him. Even if he and Cao Cao were bitter enemies, how could Lu Biao be so bold as to trust him? Furthermore, during the Great Battle of Chang'an, Zhang Xiu's forces had fought Lu Bu many times. By letting Lu Bu station his troops here, wasn't Lu Biao afraid that infighting would destabilize all of Nanyang? Jiasu simply smiled at the concern. He admitted that while Lu Bu was indeed fickle, he was still one of the world's greatest warriors. Lu Biao had taken him in, primarily to use him as a weapon against Cao Cao. As for the fates of Ding Yuan and Dong Zhuo, as long as Lu Bu stayed away from Shenyang, Lu Biao felt perfectly safe. Besides, after his crushing defeat in Xuzhou, Lu Bu had barely 3,000 soldiers left. With such a small force, he hardly had the standing to challenge Zhang Xiu's army. Zhang Xiu pondered this for a moment. So, Lu Biao's main goal is for Lu Bu to assist us against Cao Cao, he concluded, trying to see the logic. But beyond that, he also wants to keep me in check. Jiasu nodded. After all, when Cao Cao first marched south, Zhang Xiu had already surrendered once. To be honest, it was only natural that Lu Biao didn't fully trust them yet. By placing Lu Bu in Nanyang, Lu Biao was essentially planting a thorn in their side. If Zhang Xiu ever thought of defecting to Cao Cao again, Lu Bu would certainly move to stop them. As long as Lu Bu could tie them down for a while, Lu Biao could mobilize his main army at his leisure. Coming to Nanyang was a double-edged sword for Lu Bu. If he caused any trouble in Xinya, our forces were to the north, while Lu Biao's main army held the south. Trapped between them, Lu Bu would be crushed. Zhang Xiu gave a cold laugh. Lu Biao's calculations were clever, but would Lu Bu really be so obedient? Jiasu noted that Lu Biao controlled 7 of the 8 districts. With such power in his hands, even if Lu Bu chose to disobey orders, he could never truly threaten the stability of Jingzhou. So, Lu Bu had 2 choices in Nanyang: either serve Lu Biao peacefully as a guard, or launch a rebellion. The latter would surely lead to his death. There was no other way. Jiasu was a man who preferred to keep his cards hidden, so he chose not to speak too plainly. In truth, he saw that Lu Bu wasn't entirely without options if he played them right. If Lu Bu used Jingzhou as a springboard to reach the 4 southern districts, he might find a way to eventually annex the region. He could even march into Shu and rise to greatness. Unfortunately, Zhang Xiu only had the bearing of a minor lord, lacking the true spirit of a sovereign. Jiasu had already decided to persuade him to surrender to Cao Cao once more. At this point, saying anything more was simply meaningless. Zhang Xiu nodded, agreeing to wait for the army's arrival. By the beginning of the first lunar month, we find ourselves in Xinya. After several days of grueling travel, Lu Bu finally reunited with Qinggong. Looking at the walls of Xinya standing just a short distance away, he couldn't help but feel a wave of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he finally had a place to call home. He no longer had to fear Cao Cao's pursuit or Lu Biao's sudden hostility. On the other hand, if he remembered correctly, this was the same place Liu Bei would eventually be stationed. He wondered if this was merely a coincidence. Did this place hold some special significance for Lu Biao? Seeing Lu Bu staring at the walls in silent contemplation, Qinggong stepped forward and bowed. He reported that the original garrison of 300 men had already been withdrawn by Lu Biao's orders. However, since Xinya was only a small county, the walls were low and showed signs of neglect. To be honest, such wear and tear was to be expected for a place in their current state. Having a place to stay was already a blessing. At a time like this, who could afford to care if the walls were a bit crumbling? Gongtai, your success in persuading Lu Biao to accept our army is a massive achievement, Lu Bu said. Come, let's enter the city first. I will give you a detailed account of everything that happened during my trip to Xiangyang, my lord, Qinggong replied. Besides allowing them to station at Xinya, Lu Biao had also handed over the administration of Chaoyang and Yuyang districts to their army. Including Xinya itself, they now had at least 3 districts where they could establish a foothold. However, there was a catch. While Lu Biao allowed them to recruit throughout Nanyang, he strictly forbade their total strength from exceeding 10,000 men. Qinggong sighed, noting that he had privately asked Kai Mao, who confirmed 10,000 was Lu Biao's absolute limit. If they ignored the warning and expanded the army beyond that number without permission, the consequences would be dire. Lu Bu spoke up, surprisingly calm. It matters not. Lu Biao wants us to block Cao Cao's southern advance for him, but he also fears that too much power would threaten Xiangyang. Limiting our growth is, quite honestly, only natural. Qinggong nodded, agreeing that Lu Bu was right. To the north of Xinya lay Wancheng, and to the south was Xiangyang. If their army made a suspicious move, Lu Biao and Zhang Xiu could launch a pincer attack from both sides at any moment. Seeing that Lu Bu understood the situation so clearly, Qinggong felt a sense of relief. He had been worried about his lord's temper. He expected Lu Bu to fly into a rage upon hearing the recruitment limit and immediately plot against Lu Biao. Yes, that would be the usual reaction. But Lu Bu's current composure showed no sign of impulsiveness. It seemed the defeat at Shuzhou had finally taught him the art of patience. Zhang Liao, however, voiced a different concern. Xinya, Chaoyang, and Yuyang were all small, impoverished districts. Even with the authority to recruit, the tax revenue and grain from these 3 towns would hardly sustain 10,000 soldiers. Furthermore, in this part of Nanyang, neither the local gentry nor the common people felt any sense of loyalty toward their army. Even if they actively tried to recruit, it would be difficult to find many willing hands. To be honest, they were strangers in a weary land. Lu Bu replied that money and grain were manageable for now, as they still held plenty of gold and jewels from their breakout at Shuzhou. Lu Bu noted that, if necessary, they could simply use their gold to buy grain from Lu Biao. However, Zhang Liao's point about recruitment was a valid concern. The commoners and noble families of Nanyang looked down on their army, making the task of finding new recruits quite difficult, to say the least. Unless a major local clan was willing to assist them, they would struggle. Back in Bingzhou, things would have been very different. In his home territory, Lu Bu's name alone could have raised 30,000 men. But here in Nanyang, he was essentially a stranger. He had no foundation among the people. After all, if someone wanted to join an army, why wouldn't they just choose Lu Biao instead? They could even join Zhang Xiao. Realizing his options were limited, Lu Bu turned to Qin Gong with a look of quiet expectation. His inner circle was small, with Qin Gong as his only strategist and Zhang Liao and Gao Shun as his primary generals. While he understood the broad strokes of history, the practical task of building an army required a more local touch. He needed Qin Gong's counsel. After a moment of thought, the strategist asked if his lord had heard of the Deng family of Xinya. Lu Bu nodded, asking if he meant the descendants of the famous Deng Yu. Yes, he had heard of them. Since Emperor Guangwu himself was from Nanyang, many of his most trusted officials also hailed from this very region. The family Qin Gong referred to was descended from the man who ranked first among the legendary 28 generals of Yuntai. If Lu Bu remembered correctly, the future General Deng Ji was a descendant of this prestigious lineage. Qin Gong continued, explaining that while he was in Xiangyang, he had picked up an interesting piece of news. It seemed the current head of the family, Deng Tong, was planning to move his entire household away to the Shu region. If they could somehow persuade Deng Tong to serve their cause, it would be a massive boost to their recruitment efforts in Xinya. Lu Bu was puzzled. The Dengs were a prominent local family, and while Xinya was near the front lines, it wasn't in immediate danger. Cao Cao's forces weren't ready to push south just yet. Why would Deng Tong want to uproot his entire life and flee to Shu now? Qin Gong explained that the Deng family's peak had been during the reigns of Emperors Guangwu and Ming. Later, when Deng Mingnu became empress, the family's power grew even further, though her combative nature eventually led to trouble. She held immense power in the inner palace, but eventually provoked Emperor Huan and was imprisoned, where she died in deep melancholy. Because of their connection to Deng Mingnu, the once illustrious Deng family nearly faced total annihilation during that turbulent time. By the time Emperor Ling took the throne, the family had fallen into further decay, which explains why Deng Tong now wants to move. He hopes to find stability in the Shu region and fears that Xinya will become a bloody battlefield when Cao Cao's army inevitably returns. Lu Bu thought for a moment before asking if Qin Gong's plan was to win over the family with their supplies. The idea was to use their grain and gold to befriend the Dengs, then ask Deng Tong to assist with recruitment. A solid plan, honestly. We see that while Nanyang is full of noble families, most of them hold nothing but disdain for Lu Bu's wandering army. But the Deng family is different. They are in a moment of crisis, and a friendly gesture from Lu Bu might be exactly what they need. Deng Tong would likely take the opportunity to cooperate, so Lu Bu officially entrusted the delicate matter to Qin Gong's capable hands. Furthermore, he ordered a formal invitation to be sent to Zhang Xiao, planning to travel to Wansheng with Gao Shun in 10 days. He knew that if he ever wanted to recruit the brilliant Jiasu, Zhang Xiao was an obstacle he simply had to face directly. By then, things in Xinya would be stable enough for him to justify a personal trip to Wansheng to see the situation for himself. Regardless of the risks, he wanted to meet Zhang Xiao, though Gao Shun couldn't help but worry about his lord's safety. He reminded Lu Bu that they had no real friendship with Zhang Xiao. In fact, they had fought against each other back in Chang'an. He feared that if Zhang Xiao decided to seize Lu Bu upon his arrival, they would be helpless. Lu Bu, however, only smiled. He planned to send a letter to the prefect of Jiangxia, Huang Yu, asking him to join the party as a safeguard. With Huang Yu by his side, Zhang Xiao wouldn't dare to make a move, despite Lu Bu having fewer than 3,000 men left. Jingzhou, on the other hand, boasted 100,000 troops and a gallery of famous generals, a much more intimidating force. Since Lu Bu was currently Lu Biao's vanguard against Cao Cao, bringing Huang Yu along was a clever way to borrow some borrowed authority. As the meeting concluded and Qin Gong rose to contact the Deng family, Lu Bu gestured for him to wait just a moment longer. He lowered his voice and told Qin Gong that while Zhang Xiao's own abilities were merely average, his advisor, Jia Su, was another matter entirely. Lu Bu admitted he had been eyeing this master strategist for a long time, and that he and Zhang Liao had already discussed a small plan. He wanted to take this opportunity to win Jia Su over and invited Qin Gong to help refine the details of the scheme. After the crushing defeat at Shuzhou, Lu Bu had come to trust Qin Gong completely, so there was no need to keep such ambitions a secret. Qin Gong wasn't in a hurry to hear the plan. Instead, he was curious about a specific term Lu Bu had used, a grandmaster of strategy. It wasn't surprising that Lu Bu wanted to recruit a top-tier mind like Jia Su, but the specific title piqued Qin Gong's interest. He didn't quite understand what Lu Bu meant by calling Jia Su a grandmaster, which prompted a small, knowing smile from his lord. Lu Bu referenced the ancient teachings, explaining that just as a master of chess is called a national hand, a strategist can be similarly honored. The very best strategists in the world can influence the entire board of history and stir the winds of change across the land. Therefore, they are the national hands, and the grandmasters are the few elite minds standing at the absolute pinnacle of that group. Naturally, Qin Gong grew curious and asked which of the world's famous advisors Lu Bu considered to be at these levels. Lu Bu began listing those further away, mentioning Cao Cao's brilliant minds, Sun Yu and Guo Jia, as true masters of their craft. He included Yuan Shao's advisors, Tianfeng and Zhu Shou, as national hands, before turning his attention to those closer to home in Jingzhou. He noted the Kuai brothers, Sun Tzu's General Zhou Yu, and even Chun Gong himself as national hands, but the title of Grandmaster was rarer. In his view, aside from Jia Su, only the former governor of Yizhou, Lu Yan, truly deserved to be called a Grandmaster at this moment. We see that while men like Guijia and Sun Yu certainly had the talent, Lu Bu felt they hadn't reached their full potential just yet. They would only truly earn the title of Grandmaster after the Battle of Guandu, just as Zhou Yu would need the fires of Red Cliff to mature. As for Tianfeng and Zhu Shou, they were simply unfortunate. Yuan Shao's eventual defeat at Guandu would cost them their chance at greatness. Once Yuan Shao lost his power to contend for the world, the resources available to his strategists would inevitably dwindle to nothing. With fewer pieces to move on the board and no legendary victories to their names, they could never truly be called grandmasters. We see that having the potential of a national hand doesn't guarantee one becomes a grandmaster, and Shen Gong, feeling a bit slighted, brought up the chaos after Dongzhu's death. Back then, the Liangzhou warlords were scattering in fear until Jia Su, using nothing but his own wits, managed to persuade Li Ju and Guisi to stand their ground. They eventually counterattacked Chang'an and seized control of the court, so Chun Gong admitted that if Lu Bu called Jia Su a grandmaster, he could certainly agree. However, he questioned what Lu Yan had ever done to deserve such high praise, especially when compared to famous minds like Sun Yu, Guijia, Tianfeng, or the Kuai brothers. These were all renowned scholars of the era, and their strategic abilities were undeniably formidable. Take Sun Yu, for instance, who was famous even in his youth. He was hailed as a talent fit to assist kings, later providing the steady, central guidance that allowed Cao Cao to command authority in every direction. Then there was Guijia, whose brilliant strategies earned him the title of Cao Cao's miracle talent, often accompanying the army on every major campaign. To be honest, we shouldn't look too far for examples. The majority of the schemes that led to Lu Bu's recent defeat at Shuzhou were the work of Guijia himself. Meanwhile, Tianfeng and Zhu Shou had assisted Yuan Shao in unifying Hebei, securing a massive territory spanning 4 entire provinces. And when Lu Biao first entered Jingzhou alone on horseback years ago, it was the Kuai brothers who stepped in to help him seize control of the region. As for Zhou Yu in the east, though he was still quite young, his swift pacification of Jiangdong alongside Sun Tzu showed a level of strategy that was already world-class. Jia Su's single move to strike back and completely flip the court's power structure was a feat of legendary proportions, which no one could deny. By extending the life of the Liangzhou warlords by several years, calling him a grandmaster was, in Chun Gong's eyes, a perfectly fair assessment. But Lu Yan had already been dead for several years, and for a moment, Chun Gong simply couldn't understand why he was being mentioned in the same breath. Lu Bu smiled and reminded him that after the first emperor unified the world, he replaced the old feudal system with a centralized system of commanderies and counties. Both the Western and Eastern Han dynasties followed this model, but after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the court tried to strengthen local management to maintain order. They re-established the position of provincial governor, which eventually backfired, allowing local leaders to become too powerful to control, turning them into independent rulers. It was Lu Yan who first convinced the emperor to restore these governors, and then he seized the opportunity to enter and take control of Yizhou for himself. Finally, he strategically placed Zhang Lu in Hanzhong, effectively cutting off all communication between the imperial court and his own territory in Yizhou. From that point on, he reigned supreme in his own isolated kingdom, treating the emperor as if he didn't exist, a masterstroke of long-term planning, if we look at it that way. Lu Bu then asked Qin Gong if he still felt Lu Yan was unworthy of being called a grandmaster, especially when compared to his son, the rather disastrous Lu Zhang. In his view, Lu Yan's schemes were incredibly sophisticated. Had he not died so early, Liu Bei might never have had the chance to enter the region at all. Qin Gong sighed, admitting that his lord saw things much more clearly while his own vision had been narrow, but Lu Bu simply waved the praise away. We see him shift the focus, suggesting they discuss how to actually lure Jia Su away from Zhang Xiu's service and into their own ranks. Qin Gong couldn't help but offer a bitter smile, noting that since Lu Bu had praised Jia Su so highly, such a brilliant mind wouldn't be easily swayed. He argued that if Jia Su wasn't willing to serve, forcing him would be nearly impossible, but Lu Bu simply smiled, believing that anything is possible with effort. Besides, Lu Bu pointed out that they had the advantage of the shadows. Jia Su was out in the open, completely unaware that they were even targeting him. With a proper plan, success wasn't just a dream, and so Qin Gong nodded, asking his lord to explain the details of this mysterious strategy. Lu Bu began by noting that Jia Su was known to be a deeply filial son who also held a profound affection for his wife and children. However, when he went to join Zhang Xiu, his entire family remained behind at the estate of Duan Wei, the governor of Beatty. The plan was surprisingly straightforward. The first step involved sending men to Beatty disguised as messengers sent by Jia Su himself. They would simply check on the family's well-being, but since Beatty was Duan Wei's territory, the news would travel fast. Naturally, Duan Wei would soon hear that someone was asking questions about the safety and comfort of Jiasu's relatives. Duan Wei would likely feel too awkward to ask Jiasu directly if he had sent them in, so he would simply write a letter instead. He would offer to escort the family to Wanqing in the near future, and since Jiasu was now well established under Zhang Xiu, he would likely agree. With Cao Cao's army currently unable to move south toward Jingzhou, Wanqing seemed like a perfectly safe place for a family reunion. Once Jiasu received the letter, he would undoubtedly give his consent to bring his loved ones home, which led to the final, crucial step. Lu Bu planned to have his men intercept the carriage mid-journey, eliminate Duan Wei's guards, and quietly escort the family to Xinya instead. To be honest, the first few steps sounded quite professional and methodical, but this fourth step was a bit more direct. The moment the final part of the plan was revealed, Chen Gong was left completely speechless, staring at his lord in utter disbelief. Chen Gong hesitated, wondering if this final step was perhaps a bit too crude and simple, suggesting they should rethink the details together. But as we see, Lu Bu believed that when dealing with a mind as brilliant as Jiasu's, a complex plan only creates more opportunities for error. Sometimes a direct approach is best, and so Gao Shun spoke up, noting that Jiasu was a master of hiding his true intentions and ensuring his own survival. He asked what would happen if Jiasu still refused to cooperate after they seized his family, to which Lu Bu coldly replied that they would simply eliminate him. If Zhang Xiu were to join Cao Cao again, Jiasu would naturally follow him into that camp, and if he wasn't willing to offer them his strategies, then there would be no reason to let him live. For a man like Jiasu, if he cannot be used, he must be destroyed, which tells you everything you need to know. Seeing that their lord had made up his mind, Chen Gong and Gao Shun stopped their persuasion, and 3 days later, we returned to the government office. The situation had shifted significantly because Lu Biao had finally withdrawn his forces from the area. The Deng family of Xinya, who were nearly at the end of their resources, finally agreed to seek protection, and so the head of the house, Deng Tong, arrived. Deng Tong appeared to be in his 30s, a man of tall stature and refined temperament who accompanied Chen Gong to the meeting. This man was likely the father of the future General Deng Ji, though perhaps due to the recent hardships, he looked quite thin and frail. As Deng Tong and Chen Gong entered the room, Lu Bu surprised them by actively standing up to welcome his guest personally. In the past, the original Lu Bu would have been arrogant toward these noble families, likely ignoring them entirely without a second thought. But in this era where the great families held immense power, he knew he couldn't afford to be so reckless anymore. He greeted the man warmly, claiming he had long heard of Deng Tong's handsome appearance and fine character, which was a bit of a stretch, to be honest. Deng Tong was an honest man who hadn't originally wanted to join someone with such a notorious reputation, but Chen Gong's offer had been far too tempting. Furthermore, the Deng family was truly desperate. Their only choices were to abandon their home and flee to Shu, or to place their trust in Lu Bu. On the way there, Deng Tong had been trembling with fear, terrified that this famously short-tempered general might suddenly turn violent. Yet, upon meeting him, there were no harsh words. Instead, he found a host who greeted him with open arms and genuine respect. Flattered by the unexpected praise, Deng Tong quickly bowed, stammering that the general was far too kind and that he didn't deserve such compliments. With a smile, Lu Bu led Deng Tong into the room, and after the formal greetings were finished and they were seated, he decided to get straight to the point. He explained that since they were now on the same side, he would be blunt. His army's current situation was dire, primarily because they were short on soldiers. Furthermore, they lacked food, though he noted that the grain issue was being handled through ongoing communications with the authorities in Xiangyang. Lord Lu Biao had already promised an initial batch of support, but unfortunately, the noble families and commoners of Jingzhou still held a poor opinion of Lu Bu. Because of this, recruiting new troops had seen no real progress, so he asked Deng Tong for his advice on how to break this deadlock. Deng Tong bowed respectfully, suggesting that perhaps the general was still new to Jingzhou and didn't yet fully understand the local complexities of Nanyang Commandery. He asked for permission to explain the situation slowly, and Lu Bu nodded, inviting him to speak while he and Chen Gong listened intently. Deng Tong began by noting that as one of the 13 provinces, Jingzhou had once been a prosperous land compared to places like Liangzhou or Yuzhou. Back then, governors and inspectors maintained order, the imperial decrees were followed, and the lives of the common people were relatively stable. However, everything changed when the Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out across the land. Because the imperial court was utterly powerless to intervene, local officials and magistrates were left entirely to their own devices. They were forced to allow local powerful clans to organize their own private armies for self-defense, a desperate move born of absolute necessity. The original plan was to simply disband these local militias once the rebellion ended and peace returned to the empire. But as we know, the rebellion had barely subsided when Dong Zhuo led his troops into the capital, throwing the world back into chaos. Warlords everywhere began fighting for dominance, and naturally, the people of Jingzhou were unable to escape the spreading flames of war. Once these local clans had armies in their hands, they stopped respecting the authority of the governors and the laws of the land altogether. Before Lord Lu Biao arrived in Jingzhou alone on horseback, the entire province was essentially a tangled mess of competing interests. Countless local bandit groups and clans were constantly raiding and fighting one another, which prompted Lu Bu to ask a curious question. He had heard that after receiving his orders, Lu Biao first sought out the brothers Kuai Liang and Kuai Yu, along with the powerful support of the Kai family. This was how he finally stabilized Jingzhou, proving that Lu Biao wasn't nearly as incompetent as the legends might suggest, which is a fair point, really. Deng Tong nodded, agreeing that Lu Biao was indeed quite capable, noting that after the governor took office, his very first move at the governor's manor was to execute over 50 leaders of various local bandit groups. Then, taking advantage of their leaderless state, he joined forces with the powerful Kai, Kuai, Huang, and Pang families to strike. He eventually swept away the rebels, but since these groups were backed by local elites, even a governor like Lu Biao couldn't eliminate them entirely. For the sake of the bigger picture, he stopped the purges once they pledged their loyalty. Deng Tong explained that Lu Bu's recruitment struggle was partly due to the poor reputation he held among these local clans. The second reason was practical. If they allowed their kinsmen and farmers to join the army, there would be no one left to defend their own estates if war broke out again, a point that Lu Bu now fully understood. We see that because of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the local elites in Jingzhou had all built private armies for self-preservation. While Lu Biao had suppressed them on the surface, in reality, these powerful clans still maintained a significant ability to fight back. Even Lu Biao didn't dare to completely offend them, and if they wouldn't give him face, they certainly wouldn't give it to Lu Bu. However, Deng Tong was the head of the Deng family, a man whose ancestors had seen better days, to be sure. Since he had clearly spent time reflecting on the current deadlock, he surely had a solution in mind. Recognizing this, Lu Bu invited him to share his thoughts, and Deng Tong finally spoke his mind. He suggested that since the army lacked sufficient strength for now, they had no choice but to compromise with these local clans. Governor Lu Biao had already handed over full control of Xinya, Chaoyang, and Yuyang counties to Lu Bu. With many official posts still vacant in these three counties, they could use these positions as bargaining chips with the local families. If they sent men to join the army, they would receive titles. Furthermore, it was known that Lu Bu had escaped Xiapi with much treasure. Since local elites are often swayed by wealth, they could simply use that gold and silver to bribe them into cooperation. Deng Tong offered to mediate personally, though he admitted these two methods were merely temporary fixes for their immediate troubles. Deng Tong warned that using official posts to lure local clans into releasing men for the army might not be a wise long-term strategy. Lu Bu smiled, thinking that while future problems could wait, the immediate crisis required a swift resolution. He openly considered if these two methods were viable, knowing Xinya County was merely a temporary stop for his journey. Once the recruitment of new soldiers was complete, he planned to figure out how to expand into the 4 southern commanderies. He wondered if trading titles for soldiers would allow the clans in Xinya to become too powerful to control later on. In truth, he wasn't overly worried. He noted that although these two methods were simple, they were effective. Lu Bu nodded in agreement and decided to leave the matter in Deng Tong's hands. But first, he had a question. He offered Deng Tong a choice between two positions, the magistrate of Xinya or the chief secretary of his own manor. Deng Tong thought for a moment before replying that if the general didn't mind, he would prefer to serve as the chief secretary. These two roles seemed similar, but in reality, their nature was entirely different. The magistrate role was certainly flashier. However, a magistrate was just a local official under the thumb of Governor Lu Biao, an outsider, to be honest. The chief secretary, on the other hand, was a true inner circle position, and since the Deng family had fully committed, there was no reason to remain an outsider. It's always easier to talk with clever people who know their place. Satisfied with Deng Tong's choice, Lu Bu gave him his orders. But just as Deng Tong was leaving, Zhang Liao suddenly entered with news. Zhang Gu, the son of Zhang Yang, had arrived with men to join them. At the mention of Zhang Yang's son, Lu Bu felt a sudden wave of nostalgia wash over him. Though he was a transmigrator, he had inherited all the original host's memories. To others, Zhang Yang was a minor historical figure. In the grand history books, Zhang Yang might barely be recognized by anyone at all. But to Lu Bu, Zhang Yang was his only true brother in this chaotic era. He immediately decided to go and greet him personally. A moment later, at the gates of the county office, we see a young general covered in the dust of travel, yet still full of spirit. We see tears welling in Lu Bu's eyes as he tells Zhang Gu that he has suffered far too much. Zhang Gu, equally moved, watches the general personally exit the camp to meet him. The young man immediately steps forward and bows low, introducing himself as Zhang Gu before paying his respects. Lu Bu gently helps him up, urging him to speak freely. He assures the boy that arriving here is just like coming home, promising that his father's death will be avenged sooner or later. And then, a memory surfaces. Zhang Yang, whose courtesy name was Jishu, hailed from the same region as Lu Bu. The two had known each other since their early years serving in the Bingzhou army. However, their paths eventually diverged. In the 3rd year of Chuping, after Lu Bu had dealt with Dongzhua, the situation took a turn for the worse. He found himself unable to withstand the counterattack led by Li Ju and Guisi and was ultimately forced to flee from the capital of Chang'an. Initially, he had hoped to seek refuge with Yuan Shu, but the man proved to be quite difficult. With no other choice, he turned to his old friend and fellow countryman. At that time, Zhang Yang was the governor of Heniai. Meanwhile, Li Ju and his cohorts were desperate for revenge and repeatedly pressured Zhang Yang to act. They demanded he kill Lu Bu and send his head to Chang'an, but Zhang Yang, valuing their old friendship, simply couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he played a double game, humoring the messengers while continuing to protect Lu Bu. Unfortunately, the original Lu Bu was a rather suspicious man. Feeling that Zhang Yang wasn't reliable enough, he chose to leave Heniai and seek out Yuan Shao. That, as it turned out, was a bit of a mistake. Not long after joining him, he was nearly executed on Yuan Shao's orders. With nowhere else to go, he returned to Heniai to seek Zhang Yang's help once more. Any ordinary person would have lost patience with such fickle behavior, but Zhang Yang was a soft-hearted man. To be honest, perhaps a bit too soft. Seeing his old friend in such a wretched state, he took him in again. This time, however, Lu Bu didn't stay in Heniai for very long. Taking advantage of Cao Cao's campaign against Tao Qian, Chun Gong, and Zhang Miao invited Lu Bu to take over Yanzhou, striking at Cao Cao's rear. Once he arrived in Yanzhou, he seemingly forgot all about Zhang Yang's kindness. It was a classic case of out of sight, out of mind. But later, when defeat was certain at Xiapi and no other lords in the land would lift a finger to help, someone remembered him. It was Zhang Yang who stood up once more, attempting to lead his troops to rescue Lu Bu from his desperate situation. Tragically, he was killed by one of his own generals before he could reach him. Seeing the son of such a loyal friend now, Lu Bu is overwhelmed with emotion. Zhang Gu cups his fists and explains that after his father's passing, he had originally intended to return to their ancestral home in Bingzhou. However, Jizhou was Yuan Shao's territory, making it impossible to pass through with troops, and the route through Liangzhou was simply too far. Finding it nearly impossible to turn back toward Bingzhou, he had no choice but to lead his men to Nanyang Commandery to seek shelter. Then, just a few days ago, he suddenly heard the news that his uncle had successfully broken the siege at Xiapi City. Learning that the army was heading to Xinya County, he rushed here without a moment's rest to offer what remained of Zhang Yang's guard. Imagine the scene. He started with 200 or 300 men, but after fighting his way through, only a fraction reached Xinya alive. Only 50 men remained, and every single one of them looked gaunt and sickly, suffering from severe malnutrition. Lu Bu patted Zhang Gu on the shoulder to comfort him, promising to have Xiao Fu settle them in before discussing further matters. He then mentioned that since the boy had arrived, he should go see his daughter, Lingqi, who was still mourning the loss of Lady Yan. Although young Lu Lingqi had escaped the siege, the death of her mother, Lady Yan, had left her in a state of deep emotional distress. Lately, she had been taking her frustrations out on her father, and with no lady of the house to help, he found he couldn't bring himself to scold her. To be honest, in his past life, he was a bachelor who had never married, only to find his wife gone the moment he arrived in this world. Now he was left with a daughter who treated him like a stranger, yet he couldn't forget that she was still his own flesh and blood. Because of this, he could never allow her to be married off to Yuan Shu's son, and he hoped Zhang Gu's friendship might help bridge the gap. He figured the boy could act as a mediator to soften their strained relationship, and Zhang Gu immediately bowed, accepting the task. Thanks to the deep bond with the late Zhang Yang, Zhang Gu and his few dozen guards integrated into the army at Xinya quite rapidly. And as it turned out, Lu Bu's instincts were correct. With the young man acting as a buffer, his daughter's temper finally began to cool. She was at least willing to acknowledge him when they met, which, in his eyes, was a significant step in the right direction. Next, we see them discussing the plan to secure Jiasu's family, noting that Kuai Yu hadn't dared to refuse Lu Bu's request. After receiving the letter, Kuai Yu sent a reply immediately, promising that he would arrive exactly on schedule. And so, taking Gao Shun and a dozen trusted guards along, Lu Bu set off toward the city of Wanqing. At the same time, he secretly ordered Zhang Gu to lead 200 elite cavalry out of Xinya, instructing them to disperse into small groups. Their goal was to slip toward Beatty Commandery. Originally, the plan was to wait until they reached Wanqing before making a move. He had intended for Gao Shun to find an excuse to slip away and head straight for Beatty, but after a careful discussion, they eventually decided to abandon that particular idea. Instead, they looked to Zhang Gu, who was young and practically unknown within the ranks of the army, having only just arrived. Since Lu Biao and Zhang Xiu were unaware of his existence, the task of this highway robbery, so to speak, fell squarely on his shoulders. We move to the 25th day of the first lunar month in the 4th year of Jianan, at the estate of Duan Wei, the governor of Beatty. Beatty Commandery oversaw 6 counties with its seat in Fuping, and Duan Wei, a man from Wuwei, was the one in charge. He was a former subordinate of Dong Zhuo and a kinsman of the late Grand Commandant Duan Jiong, one of the famous 3 mints of Liangzhou. Furthermore, he was a fellow countryman of the great Liangzhou generals Zhang Ji and Zhang Xiu, as well as the strategist Jiasu. When the young emperor moved east, Duan Wei provided significant aid, and Cao Cao, seeing how cooperative he was, took notice. Cao Cao appointed him as a general of the household, and by the third year of Jianan, ordered him to lead troops to execute Li Ju. Duan Wei obeyed and swiftly eliminated Li Ju, effectively putting an end to the chaos caused by the Liangzhou warlords. For this great service, the court titled him General of Jinyuan and Governor of Beatty, granting him the rank of Marquis. It was during the chaotic battles in Chang'an involving Li Ju and Guisi that Jia Su had first sought refuge with Duan Wei. However, fearing that Duan Wei might become suspicious of him, Jia Su eventually left to join Zhang Xiu in Wanqing. Knowing that Cao Cao's army could march south at any moment, Jia Su decided to entrust his family to Duan Wei's care. Since Duan Wei now held the governorship of Beatty, Jia Su's family was currently residing within the walls of Fuping. Inside the governor's study, Duan Wei was discussing matters with his advisor, Hu Yi, who spoke up with a concerned look. Hu Yi reported that over the last 2 days, several strangers with Liangzhou accents had been spotted loitering near the government office. They were asking about the family of Jia Su, and Hu Yi wondered if they should perhaps send men to arrest and interrogate them. Duan Wei simply waved his hand. He told his advisor there was no need. If his suspicions were correct, these men were likely sent by Jia Su himself. Hu Yi was naturally confused. He asked why, if Jia Su wanted to bring his family back, he wouldn't just send a formal letter instead of sending people to scout in secret. Duan Wei laughed, noting that Jia Su was a man of deep schemes and profound strategy who always insisted on ensuring every plan was foolproof. Years ago, when Jia Su fled from Chang'an, Duan Wei had provided him protection while asking him to serve as a military consultant. However, Jia Su worried that Duan Wei would grow wary of his high prestige among the Liangzhou troops, so he didn't dare stay for long. By leaving, he managed to maintain a good reputation, but times have changed, and things in Wanqing have finally settled down. If he asked directly for his family's return, it might seem as though he were burning bridges, which could potentially cause Duan Wei some offense. And so, he intentionally sent scouts to be noticed instead. Hu Yi suddenly realized the cleverness behind the move. Since the governor always acted with integrity and had no intention of making things difficult for the family, he would surely see through the ruse. Once Duan Wei realized these scouts were sent by Jia Su on purpose, he would naturally want to show his own magnanimity. To prove his generosity, he would likely order the family to be escorted back safely. Duan Wei nodded, confirming that was exactly the case. Normally, Jia Su wouldn't be in such a hurry, but the current situation was quite different from the past, leaving him no choice but to act. He couldn't help but send people to test the waters. Hu Yi thought for a moment, asking if this was about Cao Cao's invitation for the governor to join the court. Duan Wei and Jia Su were fellow countrymen, after all, and there was no real animosity between them. Because of this, Jia Su had felt perfectly safe leaving his family in Beatty Commandery, but everything changed after the death of Li Ju. Since then, Cao Cao had sent messengers to Beatty several times, pressuring Duan Wei to leave his post and join the imperial court. We must remember the battle at Wanqing, where Cao Cao's eldest son Cao Ong, his nephew Cao Anmin, and his beloved General Dian Wei all perished. Jia Su was the architect of that disaster, and he couldn't escape his connection to those deaths. In Hu Yi's view, this changed everything. He believed Jia Su was testing the waters to reclaim his family quickly because he feared what might happen if Duan Wei joined Cao Cao. He feared that upon joining the court, Duan Wei might simply hand his family over to Cao Cao as a gift. Duan Wei noted that Jia Su was far too clever for that. He would never allow his family to remain in a position of danger, even if the governor himself had absolutely no intention of using them as pawns. Jia Su felt he had to plan for every contingency, so he sent these men to see how the wind was blowing. At this point, Duan Wei paused. With an interested glint in his eye, he asked Hu Yi how they should respond. Should they actually return Jia Su's family, or keep them? Hu Yi thought for a moment before bowing. He reminded the governor that after the defeat at Wanqing, Cao Cao's deepest hatred was reserved for Zhang Xiu. Handing over Jia Su's family might earn them a bit of favor from Cao Cao, but for a man in the governor's position, that was hardly a necessity. On the other hand, we have Jia Su himself. Years ago, to protect the people of Liangzhou, he didn't hesitate to incite a massive rebellion. He had convinced Li Ju and Guisi to attack Chang'an, plunging the world into chaos. For a man known for such ruthless strategies, the stakes were high. If they were to betray his family now, he would surely harbor a deep and lasting resentment. To be honest, the choice between a little favor and a lot of hate was clear. Hu Yi's point was simple. Jia Su is the last person on Earth you want as an enemy, which, naturally, makes a lot of sense. Unless he were dead, he would eventually find a way to exact his revenge. Duan Wei laughed and gave the order to summon 50 soldiers from the prefecture. They were to escort Jia Su's family to Wanqing first thing tomorrow morning. It was a bold move, but a calculated one. The governor decided to write a personal letter to be sent ahead by a fast messenger. After all, even a man like Cao Cao had his own code. Despite his hatred for Zhang Xiu and Jia Su, Cao Cao was a formidable leader who wouldn't likely stoop to using family members as hostages. He wouldn't seek revenge through such petty means, so Duan Wei decided to go with the flow and simply return the family to Wanqing. Hu Yi hesitated, wondering if 50 soldiers were really enough for such an important escort. It seemed a bit light, doesn't it? Duan Wei explained that on the road south from Beatty to Wanqing, there were no longer any significant threats to worry about. Sending too many troops would only draw unnecessary attention, whereas 50 men would be just enough to ensure a safe passage. Hui accepted the orders and went to prepare the troops. 3 days later, we find ourselves at Zhang Xiu's estate in Wanqing. A messenger arrived, and Zhang Xiu took the letter into his hands, beginning to read the contents very carefully. He turned to Zhang Xiu and remarked that it seemed Duan Wei was indeed preparing to fully submit to Cao Cao. Zhang Xiu asked what Duan Wei had written in the letter. Now, Jia Su and Duan Wei were from the same hometown and were of a similar age. While Jia Su could speak of Duan Wei quite casually, Zhang Xiu belonged to a younger generation and had to maintain a certain level of respect. Jia Su handed the letter to Zhang Xiu, explaining that Duan Wei mentioned he would soon be entering the imperial court as an official. He claimed that keeping Jia Su's family with him might be inconvenient, so he planned to send them to Wanqing within the next few days. Zhang Xiu nodded, noting this was good news, as Jingzhou was unlikely to see any more military chaos for the time being. He felt it was finally time for the strategist to bring his family home, but Jia Su could only offer a heavy sigh in response. He admitted it was good for him personally, but for the world at large, Duan Wei surrendering Beatty meant Cao Cao's power was growing. You see, Duan Wei assumed the spies near his estate were Jia Su's own men, and since he didn't want a confrontation, he left that out of the letter. He simply didn't mention the tension at all, choosing instead to keep the correspondence polite and professional. He tactfully told Jia Su that because of his new role in the court and the ongoing feud between Wanqing and Cao Cao, he could no longer host them. Although Jia Su was a man of the world, he hadn't actually raised his guard against his old friend Duan Wei. He had no idea about the secret schemes happening in the shadows, and naturally, he failed to notice the subtle shift in the letter's tone. Zhang Xiu let out a cold laugh, remarking that while Cao Cao seemed strong now, Yuan Shao was nearly finished with Gongsun. Once Yuan Shao consolidated the 4 northern provinces, he would surely lead his massive army south to crush his rivals. At the moment, Cao Cao only held a few regions like Yuzhou and Shuzhou, which paled in comparison to the north's vast resources. In Zhang Xiu's eyes, neither the troops nor the grain of the south could match Yuan Shao, so what did one little prefecture matter? Because of the incident involving his aunt, Zhang Xiu harbored a deep, burning hatred for Cao Cao that time could not heal. The thought of Yuan Shao's army sweeping south to leave Cao Cao defenseless brought him a sense of grim satisfaction. He could hardly wait. Jia Su shook his head, knowing that while one prefecture might not change the war, the balance of power was far more delicate than Zhang Xiu realized. However, we see that Yuan Shao is a man of many plans but little resolve, possessing brilliant advisors like Tian Feng and Zhu Shou yet failing to use them. Instead, he places his trust in the likes of Guo Tu and Su Yu. While that might work against rivals like Han Fu or Gongsun Zan, it is a dangerous game. If he truly leads his army south, he may find himself no match for Cao Cao. Zhang Xiu frowned, asking if the strategist really held Cao Cao in such high regard. Jia Su replied that it wasn't just that he favored Cao Cao, but rather that he lacked any faith in Yuan Shao. He then reminded him of Kuai Yu and Lu Bu's recent visit. They had come to Wanqing to show goodwill, and Jia Su asked the general how he thought the situation in Jingzhou would develop from here. Zhang Xiu remarked that Lu Bu's show of friendship was clearly a facade, a mere excuse to scout their military strength. As for Kuai Yu, he was Lu Biao's trusted confidant and the current governor of Zhongling. His presence during the visit served a very specific purpose. He was simply there to act as Lu Biao's messenger, offering a subtle warning to their army regarding the broader state of Jingzhou. Zhang Xiu believed things would remain calm for a while. To the north lay Yuzhou, and at this moment, Cao Cao had his hands full. He was surely racing against time to prepare for Yuan Shao's southern invasion, leaving him with no resources to spare for attacking Jingzhou. To the east was the territory of Yuan Shu, a man so extravagant and lawless that he had become an enemy to all. He was essentially a walking corpse. His downfall was only a matter of days away, to be honest. To the west of Jingzhou, the landscape was dominated by the great river and vast mountain ranges. Furthermore, Lu Zhang was merely a man content to defend his own walls. He lacked the ambition to conquer Jingzhou. Lu Biao's only real concerns now were Sun Su of Jiangdong and Zhang Xian in the south. However, with Huang Zu stationed at Jiangsha Commandery, Sun Su found it impossible to break through. As for the governor of Changsha, Zhang Xian, the freezing winter weather had halted any military movement. Once spring arrived, Lu Biao would only need to deploy his main forces south, and Zhang Xian would be unable to withstand the pressure. This was why Zhang Xiu felt certain that Jingzhou would remain peaceful in the short term. Jia Su nodded slightly at this assessment. He acknowledged Zhang Xiu's view of the local situation, but then pointed out that once Yuan Shao officially moved his troops south, he would undoubtedly send messengers to Jingzhou to contact their army, demanding that they launch a direct attack. He wondered if Zhang Xiu, or anyone else for that matter, would truly be able to resist the urge to march north and strike at Yuzhou. He asked how the general planned to respond. Zhang Xiu fell silent for a moment before admitting that, if it were up to him, he would strike Yuzhou while Yuan Shao and Cao Cao were deadlocked. However, since the strategist had repeatedly argued that Yuan Shao was inferior to Cao Cao, he wondered if the man was actually suggesting they surrender to Cao Cao. We see that Zhang Xiu himself didn't harbor grand ambitions. His primary reason for occupying Wanqing was simply to find a way to survive by relying on Liu Biao. To be honest, if it hadn't been for Cao Cao's infamous lack of restraint during their last encounter, Zhang Xiu would never have rebelled against him in the first place. But the current situation was vastly different from how things stood 2 or 3 years ago. The stakes had changed, and so had the personal weight of their choices. During his first surrender to Cao Cao, there was no deep-seated hatred between them. But since the death of Cao Ong and the others, the air between them had grown cold. One could say that Zhang Xiu and Cao Cao were now locked in a struggle to the death. Under these circumstances, no matter how much he respected Jia Su, he couldn't easily surrender. Jia Su, acting as Zhang Xiu's advisor, noted that the true path to peace lay in stability rather than chaos. It was a pragmatic, if difficult, perspective to hold. While Cao Cao's army seemed to be in a precarious position at the moment, his troops were disciplined and knew when to advance or retreat, a rare quality in these times. Furthermore, Cao Cao had many talented civil and military officials at his disposal. In contrast, Yuan Shao was all style and no substance, full of plans but lacking resolve. He predicted that Yuan Shao would eventually be defeated. Once Cao Cao controlled the north, his next strategic targets would undoubtedly be Jingzhou and Yangzhou. Liu Biao had allowed them and Lu Bu to station themselves in Jingzhou for one reason. He wanted to use their strength to block Cao Cao's inevitable southern advance. But if Cao Cao were to mobilize the full might of his nation, hundreds of thousands of men, and march south, Jia Su wondered what they could possibly use to stop him. Zhang Xiu remained silent for a long time. Finally, he asked if there was truly no other way forward besides surrendering to the man who was currently his greatest enemy. Jia Su gave a bitter smile and admitted that, in his professional opinion, there was no other viable path. It was a hard truth to swallow, naturally. The strategist knew that Zhang Xiu felt uneasy, but he believed that surrendering while Cao Cao and Yuan Shao were still at a standoff was the optimal choice. If they waited until after Cao Cao had already defeated Yuan Shao to offer their submission, the gesture would lose all its political value. After all, offering help in a time of need is far more memorable than simply joining a winner. Zhang Xiu forced a smile and suggested they set the matter aside for now. He noted that the strategist's family would soon arrive in Wanqing and promised to make the necessary arrangements. He then asked if Jia Su would like a larger house for them. It was clear that Zhang Xiu didn't want to continue the discussion. He was choosing to focus on hospitality rather than the looming shadow of a difficult political choice. Jia Su let out a quiet sigh in his heart, though he kept a smile on his face as he replied that he would leave everything to the general's arrangements. And so, we moved to the 4th year of Jianan. It was the 3rd day of the 2nd month on the Western Front, located in the northwestern region of Nanyang Commandery. To travel from Beatty to Nanyang, one had to take a specific path. The journey required passing through areas like Zhuofeng and Hudong before heading south from Honglong toward Jingzhou.